It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in a small town in the Midwest, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The streets were quiet, the houses sat comfortably under the soft, gray skies, and children played in their yards, carefree as the sun began to peek through the clouds. But the calm would soon be shattered by a discovery that would change everything. Noah Sanders, a 3-year-old boy, sat at the kitchen table of his family's modest home, scribbling furiously in a notebook with crayons. His parents, Sarah and James Sanders, were busy with the usual morning routine. Sarah preparing breakfast, James reading the newspaper. But neither of them noticed what their son was doing, nor could they have ever guessed that what he was writing would soon become the talk of the town, and then the world. Noah was no ordinary child. While most kids his age were struggling to form simple words, Noah was scribbling complex equations. It wasn't that he was copying them from somewhere. It was as if they were just appearing in his mind, written out on paper with ease. His tiny hand moved with precision, solving puzzles that would challenge even the most advanced mathematicians. Sarah glanced over and saw her son's concentrated face, his tongue poking out from the corner of his mouth as he worked. She was used to Noah's quiet focus, but this was different. This wasn't just a game or a random scribble. Something about it felt strange. Noah wasn't just drawing. He was solving. "Hey, buddy, what's this?" Sarah asked, stepping closer. She peered over his shoulder and gasped. On the page before her were equations that looked like they belonged in a college-level textbook, not a 3-year-old's art book. "Noah, where did you learn these?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with confusion. Noah looked up at her, his large brown eyes wide with innocence. "I don't know, Mommy. They just come to my head." James, hearing Sarah's voice crack, hurried over to the table. He glanced at the notebook, his heart nearly stopping as he took in the pages of symbols and numbers that seemed too advanced for any child. His mind raced. How could this be? Was it possible that Noah had somehow seen these things before? No, that wasn't it. Noah had no exposure to anything like this. His parents were not scientists or academics. They were just regular people trying to make a living. "This can't be right," James muttered under his breath. "Maybe we should take him to the doctor," Sarah suggested. But even as she said it, she knew that this wasn't something that could easily be explained away. Within hours, a local teacher, Mrs. Henson, was called to Noah's home. She had known the Sanders family for years and had always been fond of Noah. When she saw the notebook and the strange equations, her professional instincts kicked in. She examined the drawings, her mind racing to keep up with the unbelievable reality of what she was seeing. This is incredible," Mrs. Henson said, her voice filled with awe. She turned to Sarah and James. "These are advanced algebraic equations. They don't belong in a child's sketchbook. Not even an adult could solve these without years of study." The Sanders family was stunned, but they didn't know that this was only the beginning. In the days that followed, word of Noah's abilities began to spread. A few days later, Mrs. Henson returned to the Sanders home with an idea. She brought a set of more traditional children's puzzles to test Noah's skills. But when Noah solved them in a fraction of the time it would take a typical adult, Mrs. Henson's jaw dropped. "I've never seen anything like this," she said, staring at Noah in disbelief. "He's not just gifted. He's a prodigy." News of the child prodigy spread through the small town like wildfire. But it wasn't until a well-known tech entrepreneur caught wind of the story that things really began to take off. Elon Musk, the founder of SpaceX and Tesla, had been following rumors of a genius child who was able to perform complex calculations and solve problems beyond his years. Intrigued, Musk's team reached out to the Sanders family to verify the claims. At first, Sarah and James were hesitant. They knew their son was exceptional, but they had no idea how far his abilities reached. They certainly didn't understand the magnitude of it all. However, after a brief conversation with Musk's team, they agreed to meet. When Elon Musk met 3-year-old Noah for the first time, it was as if time had slowed. The world-renowned inventor, who had led humanity's efforts to land on Mars and revolutionize the electric car industry, stood in awe of a toddler who was drawing equations that had never crossed his mind. "How do you know this?" Musk asked Noah, kneeling down to his level. The air in the room felt charged with tension, as if a pivotal moment was unfolding before everyone's eyes. Noah simply smiled up at him and said, "It's just in my head. It comes when I think about things." Elon's mind raced. This wasn't just a child who could recite facts or repeat information. This was a young mind operating at a level far beyond anything anyone could imagine. He saw potential, and in that moment, he knew that Noah could change the course of history. Word of the child prodigy quickly spread to the media. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon, Noah was a household name. The entire world was fascinated by this 3-year-old genius. Social media exploded with discussions about Noah's remarkable abilities. Skeptics and fans alike began speculating about the implications of such a discovery. What could a child like Noah accomplish? Would he lead humanity to new heights, or would the pressure of such genius break him? Noah's life, which had once been simple and carefree, was now thrust into a whirlwind of attention. Everyone wanted a piece of him. Scientists, journalists, and even politicians all wanted to meet the boy who had stunned the world with his intellect. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from, the online videos began to say. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? As Noah's story unfolded, the world was about to learn that his genius came with a price. And his journey was just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Noah Sanders was unlike any other 3-year-old child. To the outside world, he seemed like a miracle, a child whose mind worked in ways that no one could fully comprehend. But behind the genius was a story of an ordinary family living an extraordinary life, one that was about to be changed forever. Sarah and James Sanders had never planned for their son to become the center of global attention. In fact, they were just trying to raise him the best they could, like any other young parents. They lived in a small, modest house on the edge of town, where the pace of life was slow and quiet. James worked as a mechanic, fixing cars for people in the local community, while Sarah worked part-time as a nurse at the town's clinic. They weren't wealthy, nor were they famous, but they were happy, and that was enough for them. Their life, like many families, revolved around the simple joys of everyday life: dinner at the table, the occasional trip to the park, and the love they shared as a family. They had no idea that they were raising a child who was destined to change the world. Noah had always been a quiet and thoughtful child. From the moment he was born, Sarah noticed that he seemed to observe the world around him with a unique intensity. As a baby, Noah would stare at objects for long periods, his big brown eyes tracing every curve, every detail as if he were trying to understand how things worked. When he learned to talk, his first words weren't the usual "mama" or "dada," but surprisingly complex sentences like, "What's the reason the sky is blue?" or "How does the car move, Daddy?" At first, Sarah and James dismissed his early questions as random curiosity. But as Noah grew older, his questions became more specific, more insightful. When he was barely 2, he asked about the stars, the planets, and how the Earth stayed in orbit. At first, his parents thought he was repeating something he had overheard from a conversation, but soon, they realized that Noah was genuinely interested in these topics. He wasn't just parroting words, he was thinking about them. One evening, as Sarah was folding laundry in the living room, Noah wandered over to the table where his father's old physics books sat, gathering dust. Sarah watched as Noah flipped through the pages, his tiny fingers tracing the words and diagrams. He seemed utterly captivated by the drawings of atoms, planets, and equations. The sight made Sarah laugh at first. After all, what did a 3-year-old know about such things? But the laughter quickly faded as Noah started to ask detailed questions about the pictures he was looking at. "Mommy, what does it mean when the book says the atom is made of protons and electrons?" Noah asked, his voice small but filled with curiosity. Sarah paused. She had never heard her son speak like this before. Sure, he was smart, but this was next-level thinking. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "Well," she began, "an atom is the smallest thing that makes up everything. You see, everything around you is made of tiny little pieces." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "So, if I want to understand the universe, I need to know how the tiny pieces work." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Was he really understanding what she was saying? She glanced at James, who was in the kitchen, and caught his eye. They exchanged a look, one that said both, "This is impressive," and "We need to figure out what's going on here." The days that followed only deepened their concern and fascination. Noah didn't stop asking questions about complex topics. He began sketching diagrams on his toy chalkboard that were far beyond the simple drawings of his peers. At night, instead of the usual bedtime stories, Noah would ask his parents to tell him about the universe, about black holes, about the stars. They tried their best to keep up, but Noah's thirst for knowledge seemed unquenchable. But it wasn't just his intellectual curiosity that set him apart. It was the way he processed and understood the world. His parents began to notice that Noah's playtime was different from other children's. While most kids his age played with action figures or dolls, Noah spent hours constructing elaborate models using building blocks, models of cars, spaceships, and even entire cities, each one designed with incredible precision and detail. He would explain to his parents how the pieces fit together, using terms and ideas that were way above his age level. Despite his brilliance, Noah's emotional development seemed just like any other child's. He loved playing with his stuffed animals and enjoyed spending time with his parents. But there was always an underlying sense that Noah was operating on a different wavelength, as if his mind was constantly working at full capacity. It was clear that his genius wasn't just a matter of memorizing facts. It was about a way of thinking, a unique approach to solving problems and understanding the world. Sarah and James knew their son was special, but they didn't know the full extent of it until the day that Noah sat at the kitchen table and began writing the equations that would set everything in motion. As they looked back on the early days of Noah's life, Sarah and James began to wonder if they had missed something. Had they overlooked the signs of Noah's exceptional intelligence? Or had it always been there, quietly building inside him, waiting for the right moment to surface? But nothing could have prepared them for what was to come next. The day Noah's first set of equations was discovered, the small town they lived in would never be the same. News outlets began reporting on the child prodigy, and soon, the world began to take notice. But even as the attention grew, Noah remained blissfully unaware of the impact he was about to have on the world. He was just a little boy with a big imagination, a boy whose love of learning had led him down a path that no one could have predicted. And so, the journey began. A journey that would take Noah and his family into uncharted territory where genius, pressure, and the pursuit of knowledge would collide in ways they could never have imagined. The whirlwind that followed the discovery of Noah's extraordinary intelligence was something Sarah and James Sanders could never have prepared for. As soon as the news spread, Noah became a subject of fascination. Journalists camped outside their home, waiting for a glimpse of the boy who could solve complex equations and outthink even the brightest minds. But the true impact of Noah's abilities would soon take a more formal turn, one that would test both his genius and his family's resilience. It was a quiet Thursday morning when Sarah received the phone call that would change their lives. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was one she would never forget. "Hello, Mrs. Sanders? This is Dr. Alice Franklin from the National Institute of Cognitive Science. We've been following your son's story, and we believe it's time to conduct a formal assessment of his abilities. Would it be possible to arrange for him to take the Genius IQ test?" Sarah's heart raced. A formal assessment? Was Noah even ready for something like that? She thought back to all the moments when Noah had amazed her with his questions, his drawings, his understanding of the universe. But now, it was all becoming real, and she wasn't sure how to navigate this new world. After a brief conversation with James, Sarah agreed to meet Dr. Franklin and her team. They scheduled a visit for the following week, and soon, a team of psychologists, cognitive scientists, and educators arrived at the Sanders home. The day of the assessment was nothing like they had expected. The team arrived with testing equipment, computers, paper, pencils, and strange-looking devices. Noah, ever the curious one, immediately wanted to know what all of it was for. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to a shiny black box on the table. Dr. Franklin smiled warmly. "This is a tool we use to measure how your brain works, Noah. It'll help us understand how you think." Noah nodded, his eyes wide with interest. "I like thinking," he said simply. The test began with a set of simple puzzles, patterns, shapes, and basic logic problems that were far below Noah's ability. It wasn't until they moved on to more complex problems that Sarah began to feel the weight of what was happening. Noah tackled each challenge with ease, working through them faster than any adult could have. His little hands scribbled answers furiously, moving from one task to the next as if he were playing a game. But then, they presented him with something different, a series of abstract problems involving advanced geometry and algebra. Noah's eyes narrowed as he stared at the screen. His small face was focused, his brow furrowed as if he were solving a puzzle only he could see. The room fell silent as Noah worked, and Sarah held her breath. She knew her son was exceptional, but this was something else. As Noah worked through the problems, his answers were flawless. The team members exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had tested countless prodigies, but never before had they seen a child so young solve such complex problems with such fluidity. Dr. Franklin watched him carefully, jotting notes as Noah completed each task. Finally, the test came to an end, and Noah sat back in his chair, his face glowing with pride. "Well done, Noah," Dr. Franklin said, her voice filled with admiration. "You've done an amazing job." Noah beamed. It was easy. The team, however, was speechless. They were still processing what they had witnessed. No child, let alone one so young, should have been able to complete such tasks with such proficiency. It was clear that Noah's abilities were on a level far beyond any typical child's development. As the team packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, Dr. Franklin turned to Sarah and James. "We need to review the data, but based on what we've seen today, I can confidently say that Noah's IQ is well above the average. In fact, it's higher than most adults we've tested." Sarah's hands trembled as she tried to process the words. Higher than most adults? But what did that even mean for Noah's future? For their family? "We'll be in touch soon with the full report," Dr. Franklin continued, her tone both professional and excited. "But I have no doubt that your son is truly exceptional." The door closed behind the team, leaving Sarah and James standing in the middle of their living room, uncertain of what came next. They had always known Noah was special, but this felt like a whole new world. Later that evening, as Noah played with his toys, his parents sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of the day pressing on them. They talked quietly, wondering what they should do next. Should they push Noah even further? Should they protect him from the growing pressure that would inevitably come with his newfound fame? What if he's not ready for this? Sarah asked, her voice filled with concern. What if we're pushing him too hard? James ran his hand through his hair. We don't know what's best for him yet. We just have to take it one step at a time. But deep down, they both knew that their lives had changed forever. Their son was no longer just a little boy who asked questions. He was a prodigy, a once-in-a-lifetime mind that would make waves in the world of science and technology. The pressure would build, the expectations would grow, and soon, their family would be thrust into a spotlight they couldn't escape. The next morning, the news arrived, a full report from the Genius IQ test. The results were clear. Noah's IQ was higher than that of many of the world's top scientists, including the legendary Albert Einstein. The official number was staggering. Noah's IQ wasn't just above average, it was extraordinary. Elon Musk, who had been following the story from afar, immediately reached out to the Sanders family. He wanted to meet Noah again. He wanted to bring him into the world of his companies. The possibilities were endless, and Elon was determined to make sure Noah's genius was given the platform it deserved. As Noah's story gained international attention, the question on everyone's mind became, what would the world do with a child genius whose mind was far beyond even the brightest adults? Could they nurture his talents without overwhelming him? Or would the weight of expectation prove too much for such a young, fragile mind? The answers would come in time. But for now, Noah Sanders had become the most talked about child in the world. The attention that followed Noah's IQ test results was both exhilarating and overwhelming. In the days after the report went public, the Sanders family's quiet, peaceful life was upended. Media outlets from around the world camped out on their lawn, sending reporters to knock on their door, desperate for an interview or even a glimpse of the young genius. It wasn't just the local news anymore. National broadcasts, websites, and even international publications were eager to get a piece of Noah's story. Sarah and James were caught in a whirlwind they couldn't control. They had never asked for this kind of attention. They had always been humble, modest people, focused on providing a stable, loving environment for Noah. But now, the world was watching. It was a Monday morning when the first official invitation arrived. The email was from none other than Elon Musk's team. They wanted Noah to visit the Tesla factory. Elon Musk, one of the world's most influential figures, had read about Noah's extraordinary IQ, and he was eager to meet him in person. The message was polite, yet direct. "We believe your son's abilities could be key to advancing science and technology. We would love to discuss how we can help him develop his potential." The words were flattering, and for a moment, Sarah and James felt a rush of excitement. The chance for Noah to meet someone like Elon Musk was every parent's dream. This could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But as they read the email again, a wave of anxiety settled over them. Was this really the right step? Were they prepared for what it would mean for their son to be thrust into the global spotlight? Noah, of course, was oblivious to the storm swirling around him. He was still the same curious, playful child he had always been. He loved playing with his toys and drawing complex patterns on his chalkboard. He had no concept of fame or expectation, only the joy of learning and exploring the world around him. But Sarah couldn't help but feel that something was changing. Noah wasn't just a child anymore. He was becoming a symbol of the future, a living testament to the possibilities of human potential. And with that came pressures she wasn't sure how to handle. That night, as the family sat down for dinner, Sarah couldn't hold it in any longer. "James," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "do you think we're making the right choice? With everything that's happening so fast, I just don't know what's best for him anymore." James looked at her, his face serious. He had been wrestling with the same questions. "I don't know either, Sarah. It's hard to keep up with everything that's happening. We never expected this. But I do know one thing. We need to protect Noah. We can't let him get lost in all of this." Noah, who was sitting at the table between them, looked up at them with his big brown eyes. "What's wrong, Mommy? Why do you look sad?" Sarah smiled, trying to hide the worry in her face. "Oh, sweetie, nothing's wrong. Mommy's just thinking." Noah nodded and went back to his food, unaware that his innocence was one of the few things that still felt normal in a world that was rapidly changing around him. As the days went on, the pressure continued to mount. Dr. Franklin, the cognitive scientist who had administered Noah's test, reached out with more formal invitations, academic conferences, speaking engagements, and even television appearances. She was eager to showcase Noah's remarkable abilities to the world, believing he could revolutionize everything from artificial intelligence to space exploration. But with every new opportunity came an increasing sense of unease for Sarah and James. They knew the world would demand more of their son than they were ready to give. But the invitation to meet Elon Musk was different. It was a chance for Noah to meet someone who had already changed the world, a person who could understand the magnitude of his abilities, someone who might offer him a way to nurture his genius in a way that would make a real difference. The decision to go was not an easy one, but after much deliberation, they agreed. Elon Musk's team set up a visit for the following week. The Sanders family would travel to Tesla's headquarters, and Noah would meet the man whose name was synonymous with innovation. The morning of the trip, Sarah and James were both nervous. It wasn't just the enormity of meeting Elon Musk, it was the uncertainty of what would happen once they got there. Would they be able to protect Noah from the spotlight? Would Elon Musk understand the challenges they were facing as a family? And most importantly, would Noah be able to remain true to himself in the face of such overwhelming expectations? When they arrived at Tesla, the scale of the operation was breathtaking. The factory loomed ahead of them, its sleek design a stark contrast to the small, modest home where they had spent most of their lives. Inside, they were greeted by a team of Tesla engineers and staff who guided them through the state-of-the-art facility. Noah was wide-eyed, taking in the robots assembling cars, the cutting-edge technology, and the vastness of it all. After a brief tour, they were led to a private meeting room where Elon Musk himself was waiting. Elon stood up as they entered, a warm smile on his face. He looked every bit the tech mogul, confident, sharp, and energetic. His eyes, however, were focused intently on Noah. "Hello, Noah," Elon said with a grin. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard so much about you." Noah smiled shyly, but it was clear he was intrigued. "Hi, Mr. Musk. I like rockets. Do you build rockets?" Elon chuckled. "Yes, Noah. We build rockets. In fact, we're working on getting people to Mars. Maybe one day, you could help us get there." Noah's eyes lit up. "That would be cool. I like to learn about space. My mom says I'm good at learning stuff." Elon leaned forward, clearly fascinated by Noah's maturity and intellect. "I think you're right, Noah. You're very good at learning. And I think you could do amazing things with that brain of yours. Have you ever thought about how you want to use your talents when you grow up?" Noah pondered the question for a moment. "I want to understand how everything works. I want to know why things happen. Like, how do the stars stay in the sky? And why do we have to sleep at night?" Elon smiled, clearly impressed by the depth of Noah's thinking. "I think you're going to do incredible things, Noah. The world needs minds like yours." For a moment, it felt like time stood still. Elon Musk, the man who had sent humans into space and revolutionized the automotive industry, was speaking to their son like he was already on the path to greatness. But Sarah and James couldn't shake the nagging feeling in their hearts. They knew the world had big expectations for Noah, and while they wanted to support him, they couldn't help but wonder. What would happen to their little boy in a world that demanded so much from him? The weight of the decision they had made was becoming heavier with every passing moment. The meeting with Elon Musk had been a surreal experience. After spending hours with the Tesla engineers and hearing Elon Musk discuss his vision for the future, Sarah and James were left with more questions than answers. They knew their son was special, but they had never expected this. They had never imagined that a simple test would lead them to a place where their world, Noah's world, would be under a magnifying glass, constantly scrutinized by the public and the media. As the Sanders family boarded their private jet to return home, the weight of the day began to settle in. The initial excitement of meeting Elon Musk was fading into a more sobering reality. Sarah stared out the window, watching the clouds pass by, while James flipped through his phone, scanning the barrage of news stories that had popped up since their arrival in California. Headlines like "3-year-old genius meets Elon Musk" and "Noah Sanders, the child prodigy who could change the world," seemed to follow them wherever they went. Noah, oblivious to the storm surrounding him, was seated between his parents, happily playing with his favorite toy, a small rocket ship that Elon Musk had given him. He was focused on making the rocket zoom across the seat, his little face lighting up with each imaginary launch. "Look, Mommy, it's going to Mars," he exclaimed, holding the rocket up triumphantly. Sarah smiled, her heart aching with a mixture of love and fear. In that moment, Noah seemed like just a little boy, playing with his toy rocket, dreaming of space. But she knew that it wouldn't be long before his innocence would be lost in the expectations others had for him. The world was already expecting so much from him. People didn't see Noah as just a child anymore. They saw him as a solution to some of the world's biggest challenges. James looked up from his phone, sensing the quiet tension in the air. "Sarah," he said gently, "we're going to have to figure this out. The media, the invitations, the expectations, it's all happening so fast." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know, James. It's like we're on a runaway train, and I don't know how to stop it. I want to protect him from all of this, but how? We can't just put him in a bubble." James sighed and leaned back in his seat. "I don't have all the answers, but we can start by making sure Noah still has a childhood. He still deserves to be a kid, to play, to dream without the pressure of being a genius." Sarah glanced at Noah, who was now making his rocket ship fly from one end of the seat to the other. He was so happy, so carefree. The thought of him losing that joy to the weight of the world's expectations made Sarah's heart ache. The plane touched down in their hometown, and they were greeted by a small crowd of reporters. Sarah and James had hoped for a peaceful return, but the media frenzy was inevitable. Cameras flashed as reporters shouted questions. "Noah, how does it feel to be a genius?" one asked. "Noah, what will you do with your incredible abilities?" another reporter asked, her microphone thrust toward him. Noah looked up at them, confused, but then smiled and shrugged. I want to go play, he said, completely unaware of the magnitude of the situation. The reporters laughed, but it was a hollow, uncomfortable laugh. Sarah quickly ushered Noah inside, trying to shield him from the barrage of questions. She could feel the pressure building around them, as though their lives had become a spectacle rather than a family. Once inside the house, things didn't get much better. Calls kept coming in from academic institutions, tech companies, and even private individuals offering to help cultivate Noah's talents. They all seemed to be offering something: access to resources, connections to world leaders, mentorship from the brightest minds. But each call made it clearer that Noah wasn't just their son anymore. He was an asset, a tool for progress. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, the phone rang again. It was from Dr. Franklin, the cognitive scientist who had assessed Noah's IQ. "Sarah, James, I hope you're both doing well," Dr. Franklin said cheerfully, but her tone quickly shifted to something more urgent. "I've been in touch with several organizations that are eager to work with Noah. Some of them are offering incredible opportunities, but they come with some pressure. I wanted to make sure you're both prepared for what's coming." Sarah felt a pang of unease. "What do you mean by pressure?" she asked cautiously. "Well, there are expectations attached to these offers," Dr. Franklin explained. "People believe Noah's intelligence could be a game-changer in fields like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and even neuroscience. They want to use him to break barriers, to solve problems that have stumped the greatest minds for centuries." James glanced at Sarah, his expression grim. "But he's just 3 years old. How could anyone expect him to do that?" Dr. Franklin paused. "That's the problem. People see him as a potential savior. They see the IQ, the raw talent, and they start projecting their own hopes and dreams onto him. They forget that he's still just a child, that he needs to grow, to play, to be allowed the time to develop as a person, not just as a brain." Sarah swallowed hard. She knew Dr. Franklin was right. People didn't see Noah as a child anymore. They saw a future filled with unimaginable possibilities, and that future was being thrust onto his tiny shoulders. "Dr. Franklin," Sarah said, her voice shaky, "how do we protect him from all of this? From the pressure?" Dr. Franklin's voice softened. "You have to set boundaries. You have to remind people that Noah is a child, not a tool. And you have to remind Noah, too. He needs to have a childhood, just like every other kid. It's up to you and James to keep him grounded, to shield him from the weight of the world as best as you can." The call ended, but the sense of helplessness lingered. Sarah looked at James, who was quietly staring down at his plate. Noah, who had been happily munching on his food, suddenly stopped and looked up at them. "Are we going to Mars soon?" Noah asked, his voice innocent and full of wonder. Sarah smiled gently, brushing a lock of hair from his face. "We'll get there someday, sweetie. But right now, we just need to make sure you have time to play with your toys and enjoy being a kid." Noah nodded, satisfied with the answer, and returned to his meal. But Sarah and James both knew that the world wasn't going to give them that kind of time. The weight of the spotlight was already on them, and it was only a matter of time before Noah's innocence would be lost in the pressure to perform, to live up to the expectations that had been thrust upon him. As the days went by, the requests, the phone calls, and the invitations kept coming. Sarah and James found themselves battling to keep Noah's childhood intact while also navigating the reality of his unparalleled genius. The question loomed over them. Could they protect him from the pressure? Could they give him the life he deserved, free from the expectations of the world? Or would the burden of his genius be too much to bear? The answers would come, but at what cost? Days turned into weeks, and the relentless stream of media inquiries, academic invitations, and corporate sponsorships showed no signs of slowing down. Sarah and James were exhausted, and Noah's once peaceful childhood had been replaced with a constant tug-of-war between their desire to keep him shielded and the world's insatiable appetite for his brilliance. They had spent countless nights discussing the future, trying to come up with a solution to this mounting pressure, but it seemed that no matter what they decided, the burden of Noah's genius followed them wherever they went. It was the weekend when things started to spiral. The Sanders family had been invited to an exclusive event at a prestigious university, one of many that had reached out since Noah's IQ had been revealed. This time, It was a special summit on the future of artificial intelligence, with some of the world's leading scientists and researchers in attendance. The university had specifically requested Noah's presence, believing that his unique intellect could be key to their discussions on the next frontier of technology. As they arrived at the university, the enormity of it all hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. The event was being held in a grand hall, with hundreds of influential figures in the world of technology and academia. Their flashing cameras and whispered conversations created a buzz in the air, and for the first time, Sarah could feel the weight of the expectations pressing down on her chest. Noah, still blissfully unaware of the significance of the event, was happily playing with his toy blocks, stacking them into towers as they walked through the grand entrance. His innocence was both a comfort and a reminder of how out of place they were in this world of power and ambition. When they reached the main hall, they were introduced to a panel of researchers who wanted to speak with Noah. They were eager to hear his thoughts on complex concepts like neural networks, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence. Noah's ability to grasp these concepts was extraordinary, but at his core, he was still a child, a 3-year-old with no real understanding of the world he was being thrust into. Would you tell us, Noah, what you think is the most exciting thing about the future of AI? One of the researchers asked, kneeling down to meet his eye level. Noah looked up at the researcher, his brow furrowed in thought. I think computers can be like robots, and robots can help people. Maybe they can clean up the messes, and they can fly to the moon, he said, pointing up as if imagining the vastness of space. The researcher smiled, clearly impressed by Noah's response. That's a fascinating idea, Noah. Do you think robots could one day do things like think for themselves? Noah paused, his face showing signs of concentration. I think robots can think, he said, but they have to be really smart. Like me. The room fell silent for a moment, and Sarah's heart sank. She knew that what Noah had said was innocent, but to those around them, it was the validation of everything they had come to expect from him. He wasn't just a child anymore. He was a mind, a tool, a symbol of a future they could barely comprehend. James gently placed a hand on Noah's shoulder, bringing him back to their side. Thank you, Noah, he said, his voice strained as he tried to mask his discomfort. As they walked away from the panel, Sarah could feel the eyes of the room on them. She couldn't help but notice the hushed conversations, the glances exchanged between the researchers and tech moguls. It was as if they were sizing Noah up, deciding how best to harness his potential. They didn't belong here. That night, as they sat in their hotel room, the pressure finally broke Sarah. She had been holding everything together for so long, trying to stay strong for Noah and James, but the weight of it all was too much to bear. She looked at James, her eyes filled with frustration and fear. James, this isn't right, she said, her voice cracking. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when we're just pushing him further into this world that doesn't care about him, only about what he can do. James sat next to her, his face lined with exhaustion. I know, Sarah. I feel the same way. It's like we're losing him, like he's becoming someone else. We're supposed to protect him, but it feels like we're letting him slip away. Sarah wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. He's just a little boy. He's supposed to be playing with his toys and dreaming about going to the moon, not discussing quantum computing with people who only see him as a tool. They don't care about his happiness, James. They just want to exploit his brilliance. James reached out, pulling her into a hug. We're going to figure this out. We have to. We can't let them take him away from us. He's still our son. Noah, who had been quietly playing with his blocks, looked up at them with confusion. What's wrong, Mommy? Why are you sad? Sarah smiled softly, wiping away the last of her tears. I'm not sad, sweetheart. Mommy just gets worried sometimes. But I'm okay now. Noah nodded, accepting her reassurance without question, before returning to his play. But as the night wore on, Sarah knew that something had to change. She couldn't let Noah be consumed by the pressure, by the spotlight. She couldn't let him grow up to be a tool for the world's ambitions instead of a child with dreams of his own. The next day, they packed their bags and left the university event early, much to the surprise of the event organizers. No one understood why they were leaving. They had been told that their presence was crucial to the summit's success. But Sarah and James had made a decision. They were going to reclaim their son's childhood. They were going to protect him from the world that was trying to force him to grow up too fast. As they boarded the plane home, Sarah looked at James with a sense of resolve she hadn't felt in weeks. "We're going to take a step back. We're going to take Noah out of the spotlight for a while. Let him be a kid." James nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. It's the right thing to do. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a sense of peace. The world would have to wait. For now, they were going to protect their son. They were going to give him the childhood he deserved, away from the pressures and expectations of the world. And no matter what happened next, they would do it together. The decision to step away from the spotlight wasn't an easy one. Sarah and James knew that by withdrawing from the media frenzy, they were taking a risk. Opportunities were slipping through their fingers, and the world was watching, waiting to see what the Sanders family would do next with their extraordinary son. But the more they thought about it, the more certain they were that they were doing the right thing. Noah needed time to be a child, a 3-year-old child, not a genius, not a prodigy, just a little boy with a world of possibilities ahead of him. Back at home, they tried their best to return to some semblance of normalcy. The first few days were challenging. The phone still rang incessantly, reporters and tech moguls left endless voicemails, and academics who had initially welcomed their decision to keep Noah out of the public eye were now questioning whether they had made a mistake. But Sarah and James held their ground. The house became quieter, and though the pressure never fully dissipated, it was at least a little easier to breathe. Noah, for his part, didn't seem to mind the change. If anything, he thrived in the peacefulness of his life at home. He spent his days building elaborate forts with pillows, playing with his toys, and reading his favorite picture books. He was still the same curious and imaginative child he had always been, and that was all they wanted for him. The family spent weekends outdoors, exploring parks, hiking in the woods, and visiting local museums where Noah could ask questions about anything that caught his attention. Sometimes, Sarah caught herself marveling at how Noah's mind worked. His questions about the world were both simple and profound. He wondered why the sky was blue, how trees grew so tall, and how people could talk to each other without using words. It was these moments, simple, pure moments, that reminded Sarah and James of the joy that Noah brought into their lives. And it was during one of those moments, while they were at a park near their home, that Sarah began to feel a renewed sense of hope. Noah was running ahead, chasing a butterfly through the tall grass, laughing uncontrollably as it fluttered just out of reach. Sarah watched him, her heart swelling with affection, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel a sense of calm. "Do you see him, James?" she said, smiling as she pointed toward Noah, who had collapsed onto the grass in a heap of giggles. "He's just happy. He's not thinking about anything else. Just happy." James stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I see it, and that's what matters. That's what we've been fighting for." For the first time, Sarah felt like they were winning. She had nearly lost sight of it, but now she remembered what was most important: Noah's happiness, his laughter, his childhood. As the days passed, they found their rhythm again. They allowed Noah to explore the world at his own pace, without the pressure to achieve or be something extraordinary. And Noah, in turn, seemed to thrive in this new atmosphere. He began to show more interest in everyday things, like painting with watercolors, playing with friends, and asking questions that had nothing to do with complex theories or intellectual debates. It was a return to innocence, and Sarah could see that Noah was blossoming in ways she had never imagined possible. But even as they sought to shield Noah from the outside world wasn't done with them. It wasn't long before the calls and emails started coming again, this time with a different tone. Rather than demanding Noah's appearance at high-profile events, the requests began to lean toward collaboration. It was as if they had become more than just parents. They had become gatekeepers to a future that many believed Noah was destined to unlock. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Sarah's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen and saw an email from Dr. Franklin. She had been their trusted advisor throughout this journey, and Sarah had hoped that Dr. Franklin would be a voice of reason in this storm of opportunity. "Is everything okay?" James asked, noticing Sarah's furrowed brow as she read the email. "It's from Dr. Franklin," Sarah replied, her voice quiet. She's heard about our decision to keep Noah out of the public eye for now, and she's concerned. She thinks it might not be the best choice, given all the potential Noah has. She says that there are people willing to offer us resources that could change his life and the world. James rubbed his eyes, clearly weary of the constant back and forth. Sarah, we've made our decision. We're not going back on it. Noah's life isn't some project to be managed by other people's desires. I know, Sarah said, setting the phone down with a sigh. But it's hard to ignore the fact that there's so much potential, so many doors opening. And what if we're doing the wrong thing? What if this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that we're turning away from? James reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Sarah, I get it. I do. But right now, we need to focus on what's best for Noah, not what's best for the world. The world will always have expectations, but we have to protect him from that. Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with uncertainty. But how do we know if we're making the right choice? How do we know we're not hurting him by sheltering him too much? James squeezed her hand. We'll know because we'll trust him. We'll trust ourselves. And above all, we'll trust that he's a child, and that right now, his happiness comes first. The next day, Sarah and James made a decision that would change the course of their lives once again. They decided to reach out to Dr. Franklin and let her know they were committed to keeping Noah's life as normal as possible for the time being. They knew there would be consequences. People would be disappointed, and opportunities would slip away. But they also knew it was the right thing to do. They weren't going to sacrifice Noah's childhood for anyone. They were going to protect it, no matter what. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah and James continued their quiet life with Noah. They found themselves rediscovering the joy of simple moments, free from the pressure of the world's expectations. Noah, meanwhile, flourished in his newfound freedom. He was still the child prodigy they knew he was, but now, his brilliance came with an innocent curiosity, a thirst for knowledge that was untainted by the heavy burden of adult expectations. It was during this time, when they had learned to live outside the spotlight, that Sarah began to understand the true meaning of their decision. It wasn't about giving up opportunities. It was about giving Noah the space to decide his own future. They couldn't control how the world saw him, but they could control how he saw himself. And right now, he saw himself as a child. Nothing more, nothing less. And that, Sarah realized, was more than enough. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Noah had returned to his simple joys of play and discovery. He spent his days drawing pictures, building forts with his father, and asking endless questions about the world around him. The pressure that had weighed so heavily on their family for months seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of quiet contentment. But despite the calm, there was an undercurrent of unease, an understanding that the world hadn't forgotten about Noah, and the call for his extraordinary mind would come again. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah woke to the sound of Noah's laughter filling the house. She smiled, rolling over in bed and glancing at the clock. It was still early, and she had planned to enjoy a peaceful breakfast with James before starting the day. But the laughter was so infectious, so pure, that she couldn't resist getting up to join in. When she entered the living room, she found Noah sitting on the floor with a toy set that James had given him, an assortment of wooden blocks, gears, and miniature figurines that Noah had turned into an intricate little world. The blocks were stacked in towering structures, the gears carefully arranged to spin in tandem, and the figurines lined up as though they were part of a grand adventure. "Noah," Sarah said, smiling as she knelt beside him, "what are you building today?" Noah looked up at her with wide, excited eyes. "Mommy, look, I'm making a spaceship. It's going to take people to the moon." Sarah's heart swelled with pride. Despite everything, despite the world's constant insistence on making him something he wasn't ready to be, Noah remained the same little boy who loved to dream and imagine. "That sounds amazing," she said, running her fingers through his hair. "Who's going with you to the moon?" Noah grinned mischievously. "Everyone. Even you, Mommy. We're going to find the biggest, fluffiest cloud and jump on it." Sarah laughed, the weight of the past few months lifting off her shoulders in that moment. "I think I'd like that very much." James came into the room, wiping sleep from his eyes. He'd been up late working on his latest project, a way to secure a more sustainable future for their family, something that didn't involve the constant media attention Noah had attracted. He had no intention of letting their lives spiral out of control again, not when they had worked so hard to rebuild their family's sense of normalcy. "Morning, everyone," he said, wrapping his arms around Sarah and Noah. "What's all this about a spaceship?" Noah jumped up excitedly, tugging on James's hand. "Daddy, you have to come see my spaceship. I'm going to the moon, and you have to come too." James chuckled, playing along. All right, I'm in, but I get the window seat." Noah laughed, his eyes sparkling. "Deal." The family spent the next hour in the living room, building the spaceship, adding imaginary engines, and pretending to fly through the galaxy. It was pure, unadulterated joy, something they had nearly forgotten during their whirlwind of public appearances, media interviews, and endless discussions with experts. For that moment, it was just them, Sarah, James, and Noah, creating a world of their own. But as the day wore on, the inevitable happened. A knock at the door interrupted their moment of peace. Sarah opened it, finding a young woman standing there with a clipboard in hand. She was wearing a professional suit, and her confident demeanor immediately told Sarah that she wasn't there for a friendly visit. Behind her stood a man with a camera crew, adjusting the equipment and preparing to film. "Hello," the woman said politely. "My name is Claire Donovan, and I'm with Global Innovation magazine. We're doing a feature on the most brilliant minds of the generation, and we'd love to interview your son, Noah. We've been following his story closely, and we believe he's the perfect fit for our cover story." Sarah's heart sank. It had only been a few months since they had stepped back from the public eye, and now here they were, facing another request for Noah's brilliance to be showcased to the world. She felt her stomach twist into knots. Noah had only just started to settle into a normal routine, and now they were being asked to step back into the spotlight. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm. "We've made a decision to keep Noah's life private for now. We're not doing any more interviews." Claire's smile didn't falter. "I understand, but I just want to say, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Noah's mind is something that can change the world. People are waiting to hear from him. His insights into AI, the future of space travel and cognitive science, they could revolutionize everything." Sarah shook her head gently. "I appreciate the offer, but we're not interested. Noah's not an exhibit or a headline. He's our son." Claire's smile wavered, and she glanced back at the camera crew. "I understand, but I have to tell you, there's a lot of interest in Noah. If you change your mind, you have our contact information. The door is always open." She handed Sarah a card, but Sarah didn't take it. She simply nodded, closing the door behind her as Claire and the crew walked away. The moment the door clicked shut, Sarah turned to James, her face pale. "James, this isn't going to stop. People are never going to stop wanting him, wanting his mind. I feel like no matter what we do, we can't protect him from this." James walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We can protect him. We have to stay strong. This is what we agreed on. Noah is our priority. We will keep him out of the public eye for as long as we can. The world doesn't get to dictate how we raise our son." Sarah nodded, though a sense of dread lingered in her chest. She knew James was right, but the pressure was relentless. It was becoming clear that the more Noah's genius was recognized, the harder it would be to shield him from the world. That evening, after Noah had gone to bed, Sarah and James sat in silence, contemplating what they should do next. There was no easy answer, no perfect solution. They knew they couldn't isolate Noah forever, and they couldn't keep him hidden away from the world that was so eager to see him. But they also knew that they couldn't let the world take control of his life. "I guess this is just the beginning, isn't it?" Sarah said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. James sighed, his eyes filled with concern. "It's not about stopping the world, Sarah. It's about finding a way to live in it without letting it take everything from us." Sarah took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll figure it out. Together. For Noah." And with that, they made a silent vow to protect their son and his future, no matter what it took. The world could wait. Noah's childhood couldn't. As the days passed, Sarah and James worked to establish a new sense of normal for their family. They kept a low profile, and life in their small corner of the world returned to its peaceful rhythm. Noah was happy, thriving in his imaginative play and endless curiosity, and that was all they needed. But just when it seemed they could finally breathe easy, a new challenge presented itself. One morning, Sarah woke to an unexpected knock at the door. At first, she thought it might be a neighbor or perhaps someone from the local community, but as she opened the door, her heart skipped a beat. Standing there, with a professional air about him, was a man she instantly recognized from the media coverage. Dr. Charles Avery, a renowned tech entrepreneur and investor. His reputation preceded him, and his presence at their doorstep sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "Mrs. Sanders," he greeted with a slight smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting. My name is Charles Avery, and I represent a group of forward-thinking investors interested in making a significant impact on the world. We've been following your son's remarkable potential, and we believe he could be the key to the future." Sarah froze for a moment, trying to mask the unease she felt. "We're not interested," she said immediately, her voice firm but polite. "As I've said before, we are not accepting any offers. We're trying to keep Noah out of the public eye for his own well-being." Dr. Avery's smile didn't falter, but there was a glint of determination in his eyes. "I understand your concerns, Mrs. Sanders, but allow me to explain. We are not here to exploit your son or treat him as a commodity. We're offering something much more profound, a partnership with the leading minds in science and technology. A chance for Noah to shape the world in ways that are currently unimaginable. No pressure, of course. Just an opportunity." Sarah shook her head, the resolve in her heart growing stronger. "I'm afraid you don't understand. Noah is not a project. He's a child, and I will not allow him to be swept up in the ambitions of people like you." Dr. Avery's expression softened slightly, but the intensity in his eyes remained. "Mrs. Sanders, I know this might sound like a bold offer, but we are living in a moment of unprecedented innovation. Noah is the kind of mind that comes around once in a generation, and the future is waiting for him. We're talking about potential collaborations with global leaders in artificial intelligence, space exploration, and cognitive sciences. It's not about fame. It's about creating a legacy that will shape history. I would hate for you to miss out on this chance, not just for Noah, but for humanity." His words were tempting. They cut to the core of Sarah's fears, the very thing she had been avoiding. The idea that they were somehow holding Noah back from something monumental, something that could change the world. But she knew deep down that she couldn't let fear guide her decisions. "Not for Noah." "I appreciate your offer, Dr. Avery," Sarah said, her voice steady, "but I've already made my decision. Noah's life is not for sale. He's a little boy, and we are giving him the time and space he needs to grow, without the world demanding anything of him." Dr. Avery stood there for a moment, studying Sarah's face, before nodding slowly. "I respect that, Mrs. Sanders, but I would urge you to reconsider. This could be the opportunity of a lifetime. I'll leave my contact information with you, in case you change your mind. The door will always be open." He handed her a sleek business card with a single phone number and email address, before turning and walking back to his car. Sarah watched as he drove away, a sense of unease settling over her. Even as she closed the door behind her, the weight of what he had said lingered. Was she making the right decision? Was she protecting Noah, or holding him back? That evening, after Noah had gone to bed, Sarah shared the encounter with James. "I don't know, James. What if we are standing in the way of something that could truly change the world? What if Noah could make a real difference, a difference we can't even imagine?" James sat down next to her, his expression thoughtful but calm. "Sarah, I get it. It's hard to ignore the opportunity that people like Avery are offering. But think about it this way. We've already seen what happens when we let the world in. It's not just about Noah's potential. It's about his well-being, his happiness. The world can wait." Sarah closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. She had always believed that they were doing the right thing by shielding Noah from the pressure. But now, a part of her wondered if the world was right. Was this something bigger than them? Bigger than Noah's childhood? "You're right," she said softly, though uncertainty lingered in her voice. "But how long can we keep running from it? These people are serious. They'll keep coming." James took her hand, squeezing it gently. We'll face that when it comes. For now, we protect Noah, and we take each step carefully, one day at a time. The following week, a different kind of visitor arrived at their doorstep, one that was far less expected. A letter, hand-delivered by a courier, was addressed to Sarah. There was no return address, no formal signature, just a simple, handwritten message. The world isn't the only one watching. Be careful who you trust. Sarah stared at the letter in disbelief. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling as she read the short message over and over again. The words felt like a warning, a cryptic message from someone who knew more than they were letting on. "James," she said, her voice barely a whisper. James looked up from his work, sensing the change in her tone. "What is it?" She handed him the letter, her eyes wide. "I don't know who this is from, but it doesn't feel like a coincidence." James read the letter, his expression darkening. "This doesn't feel right. It's not just Dr. Avery. Someone else is watching us." The unease that had begun to settle in Sarah's heart intensified. Whoever had sent this letter, they knew something. Something about Noah, about their family, and perhaps about the offers they were turning down. But what was the real cost of Noah's brilliance? And who were the people that seemed to want him so badly? As the days went on, Sarah and James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being pulled into something far larger and more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. They had hoped for peace. But with each new visitor, each cryptic message, it became clear that their journey was far from over. They would have to stay vigilant, because something, or someone, was watching. The days following the mysterious letter were filled with a tense quiet that seemed to hang over the house like a thick fog. Sarah and James went about their daily routines, but their minds were preoccupied with what they couldn't see, what was lurking just beyond their grasp. It wasn't just the letters or the visits. It was the growing sense that they were being watched, even when they were at home, behind closed doors. Noah, blissfully unaware of the swirling storm around him, continued with his usual activities. He was still obsessed with his imaginary spaceship and his ongoing quest to understand the mysteries of the universe. The joy he brought to their home was the one thing that anchored them, that kept them moving forward despite the increasing uncertainty. But even Noah couldn't escape the effects of the tension in the house. One evening, as Sarah tucked Noah into bed, he looked up at her with his usual intensity. "Mommy, are the people coming to take me away?" His small voice was laced with an innocence that almost broke Sarah's heart. She sat beside him, stroking his hair gently, trying to push the worry from her face. "No, sweetie. No one is going to take you away. We're just going to keep you safe, okay?" Noah nodded solemnly, though his furrowed brow betrayed his confusion. He didn't fully understand what was going on, but Sarah could see that he was aware of the strain in the air. It was a reminder of how much of a burden their choices had become, how much it weighed on their family. The next morning, as Sarah and James were having breakfast, the doorbell rang again. This time, when Sarah opened the door, it wasn't someone she recognized. Standing on the other side was a woman, young, tall, and sharp-eyed. She wore dark sunglasses and a casual but purposeful outfit, but there was something unsettling about her presence. "I'm sorry to disturb you," the woman said with a cold, polished tone. "I'm Elena Matthews. I've been sent by the people who are interested in Noah's future. We're in the process of identifying the right educational path for him, one that will cultivate his abilities in a way that benefits him and society. This isn't just an offer, it's an investment in his potential. We believe it's time for you to make a decision." Sarah felt a chill spread through her body. She had heard enough of these offers and pressuring messages. "I told you before, we are not interested. Noah is not a project to be managed. He's a child, and he deserves to grow up free of this kind of pressure." Elena remained unmoved, her face cold and impassive. "I understand your position, Mrs. Sanders, but these opportunities don't last forever. The longer you wait, the harder it will be for Noah to catch up with what's coming next. His mind can't wait for you to decide. It's already needed." Sarah's hands clenched into fists, a rising anger she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now bubbling to the surface. "You don't get to make that choice. Not for him. Not for us." Elena didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a step forward, lowering her sunglasses just enough to reveal her eyes, cold and calculating. I'm afraid you don't understand the consequences of saying no. There are forces at play here that go beyond your family. The world is already aware of Noah. He's already a part of something much bigger, whether you like it or not. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What are you saying? Elena's voice softened, almost as if she were speaking to a child. I'm saying that Noah's future has already been decided by others. It's no longer just up to you. There are people who will make sure his potential isn't wasted. It's up to you how that happens, but it will happen, one way or another. Without another word, Elena turned and walked down the steps, leaving Sarah standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. She closed the door slowly, her mind racing. What did that mean? Who are these people? When James entered the room moments later, he could see the distress written all over Sarah's face. What happened? Sarah tried to steady her breath as she recounted the conversation. James listened carefully, his expression hardening with each passing moment. This is getting out of control, Sarah, he said, rubbing his temples. I don't know who these people are, but they're not just some investors or well-wishers. They have a plan, and Noah's at the center of it. We have to protect him, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Noah doesn't understand yet, but he will. We can't let them turn him into some sort of tool for their own agenda. James nodded, his jaw clenched in frustration. I agree, but we also need to be smart about this. If we just keep rejecting their offers, it might escalate. We need to find out who's behind all this and why they think they have a claim over Noah. Sarah glanced at the clock. It was already late in the afternoon. What do we do now? We find out who's really behind all this. We can't keep living in fear of these shadowy figures. It's time to fight back. James began researching on his laptop, while Sarah paced the room, trying to calm her nerves. As the hours passed, they both realized just how much they didn't know. There were no clear answers, no obvious trail to follow. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just a battle for Noah's childhood. It was a battle for control over the future itself. By the time the sun set, James had gathered enough information to suggest something chilling. Sarah, there's a company, Alpha Corp, tied to everything. They've been investing in the brightest minds, specifically children, for years. But there's more. They're involved in some pretty shady business practices. It's not just research and development. There's something much bigger at play. Sarah's stomach dropped as she listened to James. Alpha Corp. The name sounded eerily familiar, like a ghost from a past she couldn't fully remember. She had heard whispers of them in the past, rumors of their involvement with government-funded programs, secretive scientific research, and controversial experiments. But they were always in the background, never fully exposed. Do you think they're the ones who sent Elena? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm certain of it, James replied grimly. They don't just want Noah. They need him. And now, we're caught in the middle of something much bigger than we could have ever imagined. The room seemed to close in around them as the weight of the situation settled in. They weren't just fighting for their son's future, they were fighting for his very freedom. And if Alpha Corp had their way, Noah might never be free again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days that followed were filled with sleepless nights and uneasy conversations between Sarah and James. They had always believed they were protecting Noah from the world, but now, it seemed that the world had found its way into their lives, and no matter how hard they tried to push back, the pull of something much larger than them was relentless. James's research into Alpha Corp painted a terrifying picture. They weren't just an investment firm. They were a powerful conglomerate involved in everything from tech innovation to government-funded projects that, when pieced together, created a chilling narrative. Their interests stretched far beyond what appeared on the surface, and they had connections that made it impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about the children they discovered. It was about controlling the future, molding the brightest minds into something their corporation could profit from and manipulate. Sarah knew they had to act. But every path they considered led to a new set of risks, ones that could put Noah in even greater danger. They had to be careful, but how could they remain cautious when the stakes were so high? One evening, Sarah decided they needed to take action, take control of the narrative themselves before it spiraled out of hand. If Alpha Corp thought they could simply show up, uninvited, and impose their agenda on their family, they were sorely mistaken. "We need to gather more information," Sarah said, pacing in their living room as she spoke to James. "I don't care how we do it, but we need to understand who these people really are, what they want with Noah, and how we can fight back." James nodded in agreement, but there was a certain hesitance in his eyes. "I'm with you, but we have to be careful. Alpha Corp is not a company to be underestimated. They're powerful, and we don't even know the extent of their reach." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "I don't care how powerful they are. They can't take Noah, not without a fight." James sighed, his expression heavy. "I agree, but what's the plan? How do we even begin to fight back when we don't even know who we're fighting?" It was a question that had been gnawing at Sarah for days. They could only move forward if they had a strategy, and they couldn't afford any missteps. But as she thought about it, an idea began to form, an unconventional one, but it might just work. "We get close to someone in Alpha Corp," Sarah said, her voice growing more confident. "We need an insider, someone who can tell us everything. Then we'll figure out a way to expose them." James raised an eyebrow. "An insider? How do we even find someone like that?" "I don't know yet, but I'll start with someone who's been on the inside for a while. I'm going to contact Dr. Avery." The name caught James off guard. Dr. Avery, the same man who had visited them weeks ago with promises of partnership, the one who had pushed them toward Alpha Corp. Sarah saw the hesitation in his eyes, but she continued. "Dr. Avery may have a more personal stake in this than we realized. He's not just some investor. If we can reach him, maybe we can convince him to talk. He might be able to point us in the right direction." James seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. "I don't trust him, Sarah, but we're running out of options. If you think we can get through to him, then let's try." That night, after Noah had gone to bed, Sarah sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop. She was ready to make the call, ready to step deeper into the web they had tried so hard to avoid. She knew that reaching Dr. Avery could be dangerous, but at this point, danger seemed inevitable. She quickly typed out an email to him, carefully worded but direct, asking for a private conversation. No fluff, just the truth. "Dr. Avery, I'm reaching out because I believe there's more to this situation than we've been led to believe. I want to understand what's really happening with Noah and why your organization is so insistent on taking control of his future. Let's talk." Sarah Sanders. The moment she hit send, a wave of dread washed over her. She had no idea how Dr. Avery would respond, or if he would respond at all, but she knew that this was their only shot at getting inside the very organization that seemed to be pulling the strings behind the scenes. The following morning, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message that made her heart race. It was from Dr. Avery. "Mrs. Sanders, I believe we have much to discuss. Meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. I'll send the location details. It's time we have an honest conversation." Sarah stared at the screen, her breath caught in her throat. This was it, the conversation that could change everything. She had no idea what Dr. Avery was truly after, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let them walk away from this easily. That afternoon, Sarah and James made their preparations. The meeting was set in a neutral location, a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, away from any prying eyes. Neither of them knew what to expect, but they knew one thing. This had to be their chance to turn the tables. As they entered the cafe, Sarah noticed Dr. Avery sitting at a corner table, his posture rigid and his eyes scanning the room with an unsettling intensity. He looked every bit the part of the corporate mastermind, his designer suit and calm demeanor betraying none of the anxiety Sarah felt in her chest. "Mrs. Sanders," he said, standing as they approached, his voice smooth and calculated. "I'm glad we could finally meet." Sarah sat down across from him, her expression guarded. "Let's get straight to the point, Dr. Avery. What's your interest in my son? And why is Alpha Corp so determined to control his future?" Dr. Avery's lips twitched slightly, as if amused. "I see you've been doing some digging, Mrs. Sanders. But the question you should be asking is not what we want from Noah, it's what Noah can give us. He's the key to a new world, one where the boundaries of intelligence and technology are no longer defined by human limitations. We want to help him fulfill his potential." Sarah's hands clenched around her coffee cup. And you expect me to just let you do that? You've been pushing this narrative for weeks, but I don't buy it. What's the real goal here? Dr. Avery leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. The truth, Mrs. Sanders, is that Noah's potential is not something to be wasted. He was born for something much greater than what you're allowing him to be. And if you don't recognize that, someone else will. Alpha Corp is offering him a chance to shape the future. The words hit Sarah like a slap, but she remained composed. No, Dr. Avery, I'm not handing my son over to you or anyone else. Not now, not ever. Dr. Avery's gaze didn't waver. We'll see. But remember, you're not the only one making decisions about Noah's future. The cold finality in his voice sent a chill down Sarah's spine. As they left the cafe, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer in control. Alpha Corp's grip on Noah was tightening, and unless they acted fast, there might be no way out. The conversation with Dr. Avery had left Sarah feeling like she was on the edge of a cliff. The unsettling calmness in his words, the way he spoke about Noah as though he were a mere tool to be wielded. It was all too much to digest. But one thing was clear now. The situation wasn't just about Noah's future. It was about control. Alpha Corp wanted to shape the world's most powerful minds, and they were determined to do it by any means necessary. Sarah couldn't allow that to happen. She wouldn't let Noah become another cog in their machine, another brilliant mind used to further their own agenda. But the question remained, how could they stop something as large and powerful as Alpha Corp? As soon as they returned home, Sarah and James began planning their next move. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The stakes were higher now, and Noah's safety was no longer just a concern. It was an absolute necessity. I think it's time we start looking for allies, James said as he leaned over his laptop. We can't do this alone. Alpha Corp is too well-funded, too well-connected. We need people who know how to fight back against organizations like this. Sarah nodded, her mind racing. But who do we trust? How do we even know who's on our side? We need to start with someone who's had experience with them before, someone who's seen what they're capable of, James suggested. There's a former employee I read about. Her name is Claire Donovan. She worked as a senior researcher for Alpha Corp until she left under mysterious circumstances. She's been in hiding for a few years now, but she might know how to take them down. Where do we find her? Sarah asked, eager for any lead, no matter how slim. James typed quickly on his laptop. There's a rumor she's been hiding out in a small town in the Midwest. If we can track her down, she might be willing to help us. Sarah's heart pounded. Then we'll go. We'll do whatever it takes to protect Noah. The decision was made. The next morning, they packed their bags and left without a second thought. Noah didn't fully understand why they had to leave so suddenly, but he sensed the tension, the urgency in the air. He asked questions, of course, but Sarah and James did their best to reassure him, to protect him from the dangers lurking just beyond their door. As they made their way across the country, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every car that passed by them on the highway seemed to linger just a little too long. Every shadow on the side of the road felt like someone waiting in the wings, ready to pounce. But they pressed on. There was no turning back now. After days of driving, they finally reached the small town where Claire Donovan was rumored to be hiding. It was a quiet, unassuming place, with little more than a handful of shops and homes scattered along the main street. Sarah and James checked into a modest motel and began their search. It didn't take long to find Claire's whereabouts. She was living in a rundown house on the edge of town, isolated from the rest of the community. No one knew much about her, but the people who had spoken to her in passing described her as distant, paranoid, always looking over her shoulder. When Sarah and James arrived at the house, they were met by a wary woman who appeared to be in her early 40s. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes had a sharp, calculating look that made Sarah feel both uneasy and hopeful. This was Claire Donovan, the woman who could be their ticket to taking down Alpha Corp. "I know what you want," Claire said as soon as she saw them, her voice low and cautious. "And I'm not sure you're ready for what you're about to learn." "We're ready," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We need to know everything about Alpha Corp. How do we fight them? How do we protect our son?" Claire's eyes narrowed. She seemed to be weighing her options, deciding whether or not to trust them. After a long pause, She stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. Inside, the house was cluttered with papers, books, and old files, evidence of someone who had been trying to piece together the puzzle of Alpha Corp for years. Claire led them into a small living room, where she sat down across from them, her posture tense. Alpha Corp is not what you think it is, Claire began. It's not just a company, it's a web. They have their hands in every sector: technology, medicine, education, even government. They're everywhere, and they have connections with the highest levels of power. And their interest in your son is not just because he's a child prodigy. They see him as the next step in a much larger agenda. Sarah felt a chill run through her. What kind of agenda? Claire hesitated for a moment, as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. They're creating a new kind of human, a new breed of intelligence, one that can push the boundaries of what's possible, without the moral limitations that hold back the rest of us. They're looking to build a super-intelligent race, one that can control the future. They believe Noah is the key to unlocking this. James leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. And you know this because you were part of their research? Claire nodded grimly. I was, but I left when I realized what they were really doing. They don't care about people, about families. All they care about is creating a new world order. And Noah, he's their golden ticket. A heavy silence fell over the room as Sarah and James tried to absorb what Claire had just revealed. This was worse than they had imagined. They weren't just up against a powerful corporation. They were up against a force that had already shaped the future they were living in. So what do we do? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Claire's eyes met hers with a determined glint. You fight back. You expose them for what they really are. You make sure the world knows what they're capable of. But it won't be easy. They have eyes everywhere. And once they know you're coming for them, they'll do whatever it takes to stop you. James exhaled sharply. We're ready. We'll do whatever it takes. Claire studied them for a moment, as if weighing their resolve. Finally, she spoke. Then let's get to work. The first thing we need to do is gather the evidence. We have to show the world the truth about Alpha Corp. But we can't do this alone. She paused, her gaze shifting toward the cluttered pile of papers on her desk. We need to build an army. The moment Claire mentioned building an army, Sarah and James felt a renewed sense of urgency. If they were to take on a corporate giant like Alpha Corp, they couldn't just rely on their own resources. They needed people who were just as committed to exposing the truth and bringing the corporation down. Claire wasted no time in getting to work. The next morning, she handed them a folder filled with names. Individuals who had once worked for Alpha Corp and left under questionable circumstances. Some had been dismissed, others had resigned, and a few had simply disappeared, their lives completely erased from public record. Each person had a story, a connection to Alpha Corp's darker side. But the thing they all had in common was that they knew something dangerous, and they weren't afraid to speak out about it. There's a network, Claire said, her voice low. A group of former employees who've banded together, working in the shadows to expose Alpha Corp. We call ourselves the Resistance. You're not the first to try to take them down, but you might be the first to succeed. Sarah and James exchanged a glance. The idea of being part of something larger than themselves was both comforting and intimidating. They had never set out to be part of a movement, but now, it seemed, they had no choice. Where do we start? James asked, his voice steady despite the growing sense of danger. First, we need to make contact with the core members of the Resistance, Claire said. They've been keeping a low profile, but they'll know how to move forward. They've been gathering intel for years, on Alpha Corp, on its executives, on their secret projects. They've been compiling evidence in the hopes that one day, they'd be able to bring everything to light. Claire handed them a list of names, each one associated with a different sector: technology, government, healthcare. These were people who had once been in the heart of Alpha Corp's operations, but had seen enough to realize that something was seriously wrong. Claire's next words were heavy with warning. Don't trust everyone you meet, though. Some of the members of the Resistance are more radical than others. They're willing to go to extreme measures, and not all of them will care about protecting your son. They're focused on the bigger picture. Be careful who you work with. That night, Sarah and James went over the list of contacts they'd been given. Some of the names were familiar, people who had been mentioned in news reports about Alpha Corp's questionable practices. Others were unknown, their names barely noticeable in the context of the tech world. But each one had a story to tell, a piece of the puzzle they needed to complete. They decided to start with someone who had been a whistleblower on a project called Project Uplink, a controversial initiative believed to be behind Alpha Corp's efforts to merge human cognition with artificial intelligence. The project had been shrouded in secrecy, with only a handful of insiders ever speaking out about it. One of those insiders was Dr. Ellen Thompson, a former researcher who had worked on Uplink before walking away from the project, disillusioned and fearful of its implications. Dr. Thompson's name had come up in a few of the files Claire had shown them. Her reputation was well known among the resistance, and Sarah and James were both curious and apprehensive about what she might know. It was clear that Uplink was connected to Alpha Corp's agenda, and if they could get Dr. Thompson on their side, they might have the information they needed to take down the corporation once and for all. The next morning, they drove to a secluded cabin on the outskirts of a nearby forest. Dr. Thompson had been hiding there for years, avoiding public attention and keeping a low profile. When they arrived, they were greeted by an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Dr. Thompson was thin, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her face showed the weight of years spent evading Alpha Corp's reach. "You're here about Uplink," Dr. Thompson said, her voice calm but laced with suspicion. Sarah and James exchanged a glance before Sarah spoke up. "We need your help. We know about Alpha Corp, about what they're doing, and we know they're after our son. We want to take them down." Dr. Thompson studied them for a long moment, her eyes piercing through their words. "You have no idea what you're asking for. Alpha Corp is a beast. It doesn't just go away. If you're going to fight them, you have to understand that it's a war, one you may not survive." "We're ready to fight," James said, his voice resolute. "We're not backing down." Dr. Thompson's lips twisted into a tight smile. "I'll tell you what I know, but you have to be prepared. Uplink wasn't just about AI. It was about controlling minds, shaping them into something more than human. Alpha Corp's research was aimed at enhancing cognitive abilities, using neural interfaces to amplify the brain's potential. It sounds like something from science fiction, but it was real, and Noah, he's exactly what they were hoping to create. The weight of her words settled over them like a dark cloud. Sarah felt the air around her thicken as the full scope of Alpha Corp's plans became clear. They weren't just interested in Noah's intelligence. They wanted to harness it, to use him as a weapon in their pursuit of dominance. "So how do we stop them?" Sarah asked, her voice strained. Dr. Thompson shook her head. "I can't give you the entire blueprint, but I can point you in the right direction. You need to find the heart of their operation, the place where they're conducting the most dangerous experiments. That's where the truth is. And once you expose it to the world, you might have a chance." James stepped forward. "Where is this place? How do we get there?" Dr. Thompson hesitated before answering, as if weighing the consequences of her words. Finally, she spoke. "There's a facility in the Nevada desert. It's off the grid, hidden in plain sight. That's where they've been conducting the most classified research. If you can get in, get the evidence, you might be able to bring Alpha Corp to its knees." Sarah's heart raced. This was it, the place that could hold the answers, the truth they needed to take down Alpha Corp. It was dangerous, maybe even impossible, but it was their only shot. "We'll go," Sarah said, her voice steady. Dr. Thompson's eyes softened, just for a moment. "You don't understand what you're getting into, but I'll help you. I'll give you the information you need to infiltrate the facility. But once you're in, there's no turning back." The long drive through the barren Nevada desert was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside Sarah. Every mile they traveled brought them closer to a mission that could either destroy everything they had fought for or open a window into the depths of Alpha Corp's dark ambitions. The map Claire had given them was vague, marked only with coordinates and a single note scrawled in the corner. "The truth lies beneath." Noah was quiet in the back seat, playing with his toys as he usually did, unaware of the gravity of the situation. Sarah stole glances at him through the rearview mirror, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for him. His innocent face, always filled with wonder, was a stark reminder of the fragile nature of the world they were living in. The stakes of this mission were no longer just about exposing the truth. It was about ensuring that Noah's future, his very safety, wasn't ripped away by the very people who wanted to use him for their own gain. "This is crazy, Sarah," James said, breaking the silence. His voice had been steady up until now, but there was a slight edge to it now. "What if this whole thing is a trap? What if Dr. Thompson's just using us?" Sarah shook her head, her eyes never leaving the road. "I don't think she's lying. She's been on the run from Alpha Corp for years. But I can't ignore the risks either. We don't know what's waiting for us there. And if we're caught—" "We won't be caught," James interrupted, his tone sharp. "We've made it this far, haven't we?" His words were meant to be reassuring, but the doubt in Sarah's mind lingered like a cloud. What if they weren't prepared for what they would find? What if the truth they uncovered was more than they could handle? They kept driving for hours, the vast desert stretching out in all directions, a sea of dust and heat. No sign of life for miles. The isolation was suffocating, but it also gave them time to think, to plan. Eventually, as the sun began to set, the GPS led them to a narrow, nearly invisible dirt road that veered off the main highway. The road was rough, and the landscape seemed to grow more desolate with every turn. No towns, no signs of civilization, just the occasional scattered rock and sparse vegetation. "This is it," Sarah muttered under her breath, pulling the car to a stop. The coordinates matched the location they had been given, but the feeling of dread in her stomach only grew stronger. They got out of the car, Noah still safely strapped in his car seat, oblivious to the dangerous path they were about to walk. The wind had picked up, kicking up dust around them as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. "What now?" James asked, scanning the horizon for any sign of the facility. "There's supposed to be a facility hidden beneath the surface here," Sarah replied. "Underground. We just have to find the entrance." They started walking, sticking to the rough outline of the road. Sarah's eyes darted from side to side, searching for anything that seemed out of place. Her heart pounded with each step, her thoughts racing. Was this really the place? Was the entrance hidden beneath them, or was it somewhere else entirely? After several minutes of walking, they came across a large, flat rock formation. It was large enough to obscure the view of the ground below it. Sarah approached cautiously, reaching out to touch the surface. The rock was cold, but there was something unusual about it. It didn't feel like the surrounding stones. It felt almost artificial. "There's something here," Sarah said, kneeling down to examine the ground beneath the rock. Her fingers brushed the edge of a metallic surface, hidden from view by the natural formations around them. "Is that a door?" James asked, crouching down beside her. It was a door, indeed. A small, hidden entrance in the desert, camouflaged perfectly by the rock. Sarah pushed against it, and with a creaking sound, the door slowly lifted, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. "This is it," Sarah said, a mix of awe and fear in her voice. "This is where they've been hiding everything." James gave her a quick, reassuring nod, though his eyes betrayed his own nerves. "We have to be careful. We don't know what's down there." Noah stirred in the car behind them, his small voice breaking through the tension. "Mommy? Daddy? Where are we going?" Sarah looked back at him, her heart aching at the innocence in his voice. "We're just going to look around, baby. We'll be right back." With that, they descended into the darkness, the air growing cooler and heavier with each step. The staircase led them down into a large underground facility, its high-tech walls and sterile white lights making it feel like something out of a science fiction movie. The scent of metal and chemicals lingered in the air as they moved deeper into the complex, the silence around them deafening. As they moved through the facility, they could see signs of abandoned research labs, empty offices, and locked doors that seemed to have been left untouched for years. The place was a ghost town, yet the sense that something sinister lingered in the air was undeniable. "This place feels wrong," James muttered, his voice low. Sarah nodded. "It feels like they abandoned it in a hurry." They kept moving forward, their footsteps echoing in the silence. After what felt like hours of navigating the labyrinthine hallways, they reached a large, reinforced steel door at the far end of the complex. There were no windows, no signs of life, just a blank, imposing metal barrier. "This has to be it," Sarah said, pressing her hand to the cold surface. The door was locked, but there was a keypad beside it. Without hesitation, she pulled out the small device Claire had given them, an old, outdated piece of technology that was supposed to help hack into AlphaCorp systems. She wasn't sure how it worked, but it had been their only lead. With a few clicks and beeps, the device hummed to life, and the door slowly creaked open. Inside, they found rows upon rows of large glass tanks filled with strange, glowing liquids. In each tank, a human figure floated, motionless, suspended in the eerie glow. Some of the figures were clearly adults, while others were children who looked too familiar. "No!" Sarah gasped, her voice choking with horror. She stepped closer to one of the tanks, her eyes widening in shock. Inside the tank was a child, young, no older than Noah. But what made her blood run cold was the unmistakable resemblance. The child had Noah's features, his exact face. "They were cloning him," James whispered, his voice trembling. "They were making more like him." Terror gripped Sarah's heart as the implications of what she was seeing sank in. They hadn't just been trying to use Noah's intelligence, they had been trying to replicate it. To create an army of superintelligent children who could be controlled and manipulated by AlphaCorp. "Sarah," James said, his voice urgent, "we need to get out of here. Now." Sarah didn't need any further prompting. She turned toward the exit, but before they could make their way back up the stairs, a loud, metallic clanging echoed through the halls. Footsteps, many footsteps, and they were closing in on them. It was too late to run. The metallic clanging of footsteps reverberated through the sterile corridors, growing louder with every passing second. Panic surged through Sarah's veins, and her instinct screamed at her to move, to run. But there was no clear way out. The facility's maze of hallways and locked doors stretched out before her, an unforgiving labyrinth of concrete and steel. "James," Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. "We have to go. Now." The glass tanks with their eerie, floating figures reflected the dim lights above them, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly into the depths of the lab. Noah's lookalike still floated lifelessly in its tank, a chilling reminder of what was at stake. "We can't stay here," James said, his voice low but urgent. His eyes scanned the hallway behind them. "They're coming. There's no time to waste." They turned and bolted down the hallway, their footsteps pounding against the cold concrete floor. The sounds of the approaching soldiers echoed through the vast facility, signaling that AlphaCorp had found them. "Where do we go?" Sarah shouted, her mind racing. James's eyes flicked to the side. There. The service elevator. They veered sharply toward a narrow hallway at the end of the corridor. The elevator was old and industrial-looking, its rusted doors hanging slightly open. Without a second thought, they rushed inside, and James slammed his hand against the button to close the door. But before the doors could even shut completely, a harsh, mechanical voice blasted through the speaker. "Access denied. Unauthorized personnel detected. Lockdown initiated." The lights above them flickered, and the elevator shook, making a grinding noise as it began to descend deeper into the ground. The doors slammed shut, sealing them inside with no chance of escape. "Not good," James muttered, pushing the buttons frantically, but the system was locked down tight. "We're heading deeper into the facility." Sarah pressed her back against the elevator's cold, metal wall, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. Noah was still upstairs, unaware of the chaos below. She had to get back to him. Before she could say anything, the elevator gave one last jolt and stopped, its humming turning into a deafening silence. The doors slid open slowly, revealing a new level of the facility, an area even darker and more foreboding than before. A steel door loomed ahead, and through the narrow crack, they could make out the faint flicker of fluorescent lights. Something told them they had arrived at the core of AlphaCorp's operations. "Stay close," James said, pulling Sarah toward the door. They crept down a narrow corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly into the abyss, their eyes darting around as they moved. The silence in this part of the facility was unnerving, the only sounds their breath and the faint hum of overhead lights. Suddenly, A loud crash broke the stillness, footsteps, rapid and harsh. A squad of Alpha Corp's security personnel had entered the level above them, and they were moving fast, their boots clicking against the floor as they searched for their intruders. "Shit," Sarah whispered. "We don't have much time." They needed to find Noah, and fast. As they rounded the corner, they found a security checkpoint, complete with a large, locked door marked with a red emergency light. Beyond it, they could hear the faint sound of machines humming, a sound that chilled Sarah to her core. They weren't just conducting experiments here, they were creating something dangerous. James pulled out the small hacking device Claire had given them. "If we can access the system here, we might be able to unlock the doors and reach the main lab where they're holding Noah." They needed to act quickly. Sarah kept watch while James worked, his fingers moving deftly over the small screen of the device. His eyes were focused, and his face grim. The security checkpoint would trigger a silent alarm if they didn't disable it soon. "Come on," Sarah urged, her eyes darting down the hallway. The security team was getting closer. She could hear them shouting orders to one another. They wouldn't have much time. The device beeped, and the door clicked open, revealing another corridor leading deeper into the facility. They sprinted through the doorway, moving as quietly as they could. Just as they made it past the security checkpoint, a voice came through their earpieces, sounding distant but unmistakable. "Security breach detected. Code red. Lock down all exits." Sarah's blood ran cold. They were trapped. Without warning, the entire facility's lights flickered, then dimmed. The air around them felt charged, heavy with static. James looked at Sarah, his face pale. "They know we're here," he whispered. "We have to keep moving." They continued down the corridor, the only sound their rapid footsteps echoing off the walls. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, but Sarah could sense they were closing in on the heart of the facility, where the most dangerous secrets were kept. It was there that they would find Noah, or perhaps the ultimate truth. They rounded another corner, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Ahead, through the thin windows of a reinforced door, she saw him, Noah. But something was wrong. Noah was lying on a medical bed, his small body strapped down with metallic restraints. His eyes were wide open, but there was no expression of fear or confusion, only a cold, empty stare that made Sarah's blood run even colder. Something had changed in him. "No," Sarah gasped, her voice cracking. "Noah." James grabbed her arm, pulling her back into the shadows just as a group of Alpha Corp scientists approached the room, their conversation muffled but urgent. "They've been making adjustments," one of the scientists said. "If the neural interface stabilizes, we'll have complete control over the subject. The boy's abilities will be fully realized. It's only a matter of time." Sarah felt a wave of nausea rush over her. They had been using Noah, manipulating his mind, controlling him like a puppet. It was worse than she had imagined. "We have to get him out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Now." James nodded grimly, pulling her toward a nearby ventilation shaft. "We need to act fast. They won't let us leave with him without a fight." Just as they reached the shaft, the door to the room where Noah lay began to open. There was no time left. The sound of the door opening was like a death knell. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to James, panic written across her face. They were trapped. There was no time to escape through the ventilation shaft. The footsteps of the approaching scientists were getting closer, and Noah, her son, was still in that room, under the control of those monsters. She could feel the weight of time slipping through her fingers. "We have to act fast," she whispered harshly, glancing around for another exit. James grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with urgency. "Sarah, we can't just run in there. We have no idea how many of them are in there. We need a plan." But there was no time for a plan. Her instinct kicked in, and Sarah was already moving toward the door, pulling James along with her. There was no more thinking. There was only action. Every second they delayed meant Noah would be one step closer to being lost forever. His mind, his spirit, his very essence twisted into something unrecognizable. The footsteps were too close. The door opened further. "I'm going," Sarah said, determination flooding her voice. "Wait." James grabbed her wrist, but the look in her eyes left him no room to argue. He sighed, letting go of her arm, and followed her as she darted toward the room. She slammed her palm against the security panel next to the door, hoping against hope that it would respond. The cold metal of the door swished open, revealing the sterile white room where Noah lay on a medical bed. The glow of neon lights reflected off the smooth, metallic surfaces of machines that buzzed softly in the background. Noah's eyes were vacant, empty. He looked like a stranger to her. "Mommy? Daddy?" Noah's small, quiet voice broke the silence, his gaze still unfocused. "Don't worry, baby. We're here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. She rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she began to unfasten the restraints. "I'm so sorry, Noah. We're getting you out of here. Right now." Before she could finish releasing him, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening clang, and an electronic voice boomed. "Intruders detected. Lockdown in progress." A cold, metallic noise filled the room, and the exit doors sealed tight with an unyielding, terrifying hiss. They were trapped. "Sarah, we don't have much time," James said urgently. "We need to." But the rest of his sentence was cut short. A heavy, metallic thud echoed down the hallway, and the sound of boots hitting the floor reverberated through the walls. Alpha Corp's security was coming. Fast. Sarah moved quickly, finishing the last of the restraints as Noah looked up at her, his eyes still distant. "Mommy, I'm scared." Her heart broke, but she kept her voice steady. "I know, baby, but we're getting out of here. I promise." The room seemed to close in on them. The sounds of approaching guards were growing louder, and Sarah could hear their commands, shouted orders, the sound of weapons being readied, the distinct click of guns. James turned to the window of the door, eyes scanning for any possible escape route. "Sarah, this way," he muttered, pulling her towards a hidden hatch in the far corner of the room. It was small, but it looked like it could lead to some sort of maintenance tunnel. Noah didn't question. His small, fragile body was being carried in Sarah's arms, and his face, still pale and confused, was pressed against her shoulder as they dashed toward the hatch. With one last glance behind them, Sarah activated the release for the hatch, and it opened with a quiet hiss. "Go," James urged. They crawled through the small opening one by one, squeezing through the dark, narrow passageway that smelled of dust and old machinery. The space was tight, and they had no idea how deep they were, or where it would lead. But they had no choice. The sounds of Alpha Corp's security team were almost at their backs, and they couldn't afford to waste a single moment. Noah's breathing was shaky, his small hands gripping Sarah tightly as they made their way deeper into the tunnel. "Mommy, what's happening?" His voice wavered with fear. Sarah pressed her cheek to his hair, trying to keep him calm. "We're going to get you out, baby. Just stay close, okay?" They moved as fast as they could, their footsteps muffled by the concrete walls of the tunnel. The air was heavy with tension, and the only sound was their rapid breathing and the occasional scuffle of their shoes against the dust-covered floor. James led the way, his body tense with every step. "I don't know how much further we can go, Sarah. If we don't find an exit soon, we're going to be trapped." "Just keep moving," Sarah urged, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, as if on cue, they rounded a bend in the tunnel, and Sarah froze. Ahead of them, glowing lights from an underground parking garage flickered faintly, illuminating the darkness. The sound of the security team had stopped, replaced by the unsettling silence of the facility's deeper levels. They weren't out yet. The facility wasn't just a maze of hallways, it was a fortress. The thought of how deeply Alpha Corp's control reached over this complex made Sarah's skin crawl. They needed to hurry, before everything collapsed around them. "Look," James said, pointing ahead. A large steel door loomed in front of them, a security panel attached beside it. It wasn't an easy escape. The steel door was reinforced, and the security panel looked like it would require more than just brute force to open. But it was their best shot. "Help me with this," James said, already moving toward the panel. Sarah watched anxiously as he pulled out the small hacking device again, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. The seconds felt like hours. Sarah's thoughts raced, and her heart pounded louder than the ticking clock that seemed to echo in her ears. Finally, with a small, satisfying beep. The security panel lit up green, and the door slowly creaked open. "We're through," James exclaimed. They dashed through the door, emerging into the underground parking garage. The air was cooler, the sounds of the outside world muffled by the thick concrete walls. But they weren't safe yet. They could still hear the faint sounds of guards in the distance, moving through the darkened halls above them. Every second felt like a countdown to disaster. "There," Sarah pointed ahead, spotting a set of old, beat-up cars parked at the far side of the garage. They sprinted toward the nearest vehicle, a dusty, rusted van that looked like it had been abandoned for years. James was already behind the wheel, tearing open the door. "Get in," he shouted. Noah was still in her arms, his tiny body trembling as she carefully buckled him into the back seat. The moment the seatbelt clicked into place, Sarah turned back to James, who had already started the engine. "Hold on," James yelled, slamming the gear shift into drive and speeding toward the exit. The vehicle jolted forward, the tires screeching as they flew toward the exit of the garage. Sarah glanced back, half expecting to see Alpha Corp's security on their tail. But they were gone. For now, as they broke through the underground complex and emerged into the open air, Sarah allowed herself one brief moment to breathe. They were out, alive, and with Noah in her arms, safe for now. But the danger wasn't over. It had only just begun. The van sped through the night, its engine growling as it tore down the empty, desolate roads. The city's skyline faded into the distance behind them, leaving only the deep, unbroken darkness ahead. Sarah sat in the back, her eyes fixed on Noah, who was slumped against the seat, his small face pale but calm, his eyes still distant. "Are you okay, baby?" Sarah asked softly, her hand brushing through Noah's messy hair. Noah didn't respond right away. His eyes were glazed over, as if he wasn't fully aware of what had just happened or where they were going. He had been through too much. The things Alpha Corp had done to him, those experiments, the manipulation of his mind, the way they used him as a pawn in their twisted game. It was enough to break any child's spirit. "I'm fine," Noah muttered finally, his voice barely audible. "I just want to go home." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them away. Home. She wanted the same thing. But it seemed like home was nothing but a distant dream now. Alpha Corp had taken so much from them, and it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She glanced at James, who was gripping the steering wheel tightly, his face tense as he navigated the winding roads. His eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. He was the one who had been the most practical about their escape, the one who had kept them together when everything seemed lost. But even James couldn't hide the strain in his expression. He had to know they were running out of time. "How much further?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice hoarse from the stress of the night. "We'll be at the safe house in another hour or so," James replied, his tone focused, though his face was lined with exhaustion. "We just need to lay low for a while. Alpha Corp won't stop looking for us." "I know," Sarah said, her gaze shifting back to Noah. "But we can't stay hidden forever. We need to figure out how to stop them. All of this, everything they've done, it's all leading to something bigger. Noah, he's not just their test subject anymore. He's their weapon." James nodded grimly. They've got plans for him. And it's not just about control. It's about using him to take down anyone who threatens Alpha Corp. Then we have to stop them. Sarah's words were resolute, a fierce determination filling her chest. "We have to get Noah back to where he belongs." Noah's eyes flicked up to meet her gaze for a brief moment, and for the first time, there was a flicker of recognition in them, something human. "I want to help," he whispered. Sarah's heart cracked. Noah wanted to help, but he was just a child. A genius, yes, but still a child who had been forced into a battle he didn't fully understand. "I know, sweetheart. But for now, we have to focus on keeping you safe. The rest will come later. I promise." Noah seemed to accept that, his body relaxing as he settled back into the seat. But Sarah knew better. The journey ahead was going to be anything but easy. Alpha Corp had too many resources, too many eyes watching them from the shadows. If they were going to bring the corporation down, they needed a plan, and they needed allies. James's voice broke through her thoughts. We need to get you back to your old team. They'll know how to help us take Alpha Corp down. Sarah raised an eyebrow, confusion flickering in her mind. My team? You mean Claire and the others? Yeah, James said, glancing over at her. We need everyone we can get. They've been working on some top-secret projects, things that could help us. But they've also been tracking Alpha Corp for years. They might have some information we don't. Sarah paused. She hadn't seen Claire and the team in months, not since they'd all gone into hiding. Claire had been her most trusted ally, the one person who had always been there, even when everything else had fallen apart. But could Sarah trust them now, after everything that had happened? After Alpha Corp had grown so much more powerful, more dangerous? We can't just go to them without knowing if they're safe, Sarah said, a hint of caution in her voice. James's grip on the wheel tightened. I know, but it's our best shot. We can't do this alone. And we need information on how to bring Alpha Corp down from the inside. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of their decision. They were heading into uncharted territory. They didn't know if they could trust Claire or her team anymore, not with Alpha Corp closing in on them. But they had no other choice. After a long moment, Sarah spoke. Let's do it. But we go in cautiously. We can't risk exposing Noah. James nodded. Agreed. They continued driving in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Noah had fallen asleep, his small body curled up against the seat, but Sarah could feel the weight of the night pressing down on her. She had to protect him. She had to make sure he didn't become just another pawn in Alpha Corp's twisted game. The night seemed endless as they drove through the darkened roads, the cold, unfeeling world around them offering no comfort, no solace. But Sarah knew they couldn't stop now. They had a mission, and with Noah's life and future at stake, failure was not an option. Hours later, they arrived at the safe house. It was an unassuming building nestled in a quiet, secluded area. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a rundown farmhouse. But to Sarah, it was a symbol of safety, a temporary refuge before the storm they would soon face. As James parked the van, Sarah's mind raced. She glanced at Noah, who was still fast asleep. He looked peaceful, almost innocent, a far cry from the boy who had been subjected to so much horror. We'll rest here tonight, James said as he turned off the engine. Then we figure out our next move. Sarah nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Alpha Corp's reach was far too wide. They couldn't afford to stay hidden for long. I'll stay with him, Sarah said softly, nodding toward Noah. You check the perimeter. James hesitated for a moment before nodding. I'll make sure we're safe. No one's getting in or out without us knowing. As James stepped out of the van, Sarah leaned back against the seat, her eyes fixed on Noah. He was safe, for now, but she knew they were running out of time. They had to figure out how to destroy Alpha Corp once and for all. And to do that, they would need to get close. Very close. The safe house was quiet, too quiet. Sarah sat beside Noah, watching him sleep as the dim light from a single bulb above flickered occasionally, casting long, stretching shadows across the room. She could hear the distant sounds of night animals outside, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But inside the walls of this makeshift refuge, it felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. She didn't trust the silence. It felt like the calm before a storm, before everything went wrong again. James had gone outside to do his usual checks. Sarah knew that it was necessary, but a part of her felt uneasy with him being out of sight. After all, they had already escaped one disaster, but Alpha Corp wasn't going to stop chasing them. Not when they had the most valuable piece of their experiment right in their hands. Noah? Sarah's mind kept drifting back to the same question that had been eating at her ever since their escape. What if Claire wasn't who she used to be? What if she'd been compromised in some way, like so many others in their past? She had to admit, the idea of trusting Claire with Noah, after all that had happened, terrified her. What if they walked straight into another trap? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft, almost imperceptible sound, the creak of a floorboard just outside the door. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She quickly rose to her feet, moving silently toward the door. Noah stirred but didn't wake, still clinging to his fitful dreams. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she crouched by the door, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the handle. The creak sounded again, followed by the faint scrape of something dragging against the floor. Someone was there. Sarah slowly, deliberately, reached for the small handgun James had left with her, and with the weapon in her hand, she carefully opened the door just a crack. Her heart raced, her senses on high alert as she peered through the opening. It was James. He was standing outside, scanning the area, but his posture was wrong. He was tense, his movements jerky, unnatural. He looked off, and then, just as quickly as the thought entered her mind, he turned to face her, a strange smile spreading across his face. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice flat, almost robotic. "You should come outside. There's something you need to see." Sarah's blood ran cold. That wasn't the James she knew. Her hand tightened around the gun, her instinct screaming at her that something was wrong. The man standing in front of her wasn't the person she'd spent the last several months with. The friendly, loyal James she trusted with her life was gone, replaced by someone, or something, else. "James?" she asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. "What's going on?" He stepped forward, still smiling, his eyes glassy, distant. "It's time, Sarah. Time to end this." Her heart sank as she realized the horrifying truth. James wasn't James anymore. He had been compromised, manipulated, just like Noah. She had trusted him, believed in him. But now she saw the cold, calculating look in his eyes. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that this was no longer just a fight for survival. This was a battle for their very souls. Without thinking, Sarah raised the gun, her fingers steady on the trigger. But James didn't flinch. Instead, he laughed, a dark, hollow sound that sent chills down her spine. "Go ahead, Sarah," he taunted. "Pull the trigger. It won't change anything. We've all been chosen." Sarah hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. Chosen? Chosen for what? And by whom? Before she could process his words, the door behind her swung open, and she spun around, her gun still raised. But it wasn't just James who was standing there now. Two figures emerged from the shadows. One of them was tall, imposing, his face hidden behind a black mask. The other was a woman, her eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. "Sarah, we've been waiting for you," the woman said in a voice that sounded almost mechanical, like a broken record. "Welcome to the new world." In an instant, Sarah's mind raced. These weren't just strangers. They were part of the very system she'd been fighting against. Alpha Corp's agents, sent to capture her and Noah, to finish what had been started. They had been waiting for her. They had always been waiting for her. And James, he was just another pawn in their game. Before she could react, the man lunged forward with terrifying speed, knocking the gun from her hand and sending her crashing into the wall. Pain shot through her side, but she barely had time to register it before she was grabbed by the woman, whose cold hands held her in a vice-like grip. "No!" Sarah screamed, but the woman's grip tightened, making it hard to breathe. "Don't fight it," the woman hissed in her ear. "You've already lost. The truth is, you were never meant to win. None of us were." Sarah struggled, her body thrashing against the woman's iron-like hold, but it was no use. There was too much power in her arms, too much force in the way she held her down. And then, as if on cue, the sound of a loud, mechanical hum filled the air. The woman's eyes glowed brighter, and Sarah's vision started to blur. A strange force washed over her, and her mind began to fog. It felt as though the woman was draining her, taking away her very will to fight. "No!" Sarah gasped. "Stop. Let me go." But the woman only smiled, her grip never loosening. The man, James, stepped closer, watching her struggle with detached amusement. "You see, Sarah," James said, his voice chillingly calm, "you were always meant to help us, whether you wanted to or not." Sarah's heart pounded, her body weakening as she felt the control over her slip away. The world around her started to fade, and in the distance, she heard Noah's voice, soft, scared. "Mom, where are you?" His voice, small and vulnerable, was all it took. It reignited the fire inside her. She wouldn't, let them take him. With everything she had left, Sarah pulled her legs up, twisting violently out of the woman's hold. She barely had time to react before she grabbed a nearby metal rod and swung it with all her strength at the woman's head. The woman staggered back, momentarily dazed, and Sarah took her chance. She sprinted toward Noah, her legs shaking beneath her as she reached for the boy. James was already stepping forward, his hand outstretched, ready to stop her. But Sarah didn't hesitate. She dove for Noah, her arms wrapping tightly around him, pulling him close as she sprinted toward the back door, the only way out. There was no time to think, no time to plan. The chase was on. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the abandoned safe house as Sarah dashed toward the back door, her heart pounding in her chest. Noah, still clinging to her tightly, was awake now, his wide eyes filled with fear. He must have sensed the danger in the air, the same instinctual dread that Sarah had felt from the moment they arrived. She could hear the pounding of feet behind them. James and the woman were relentless in their pursuit, their footsteps growing louder with each passing second. But Sarah wasn't about to let them catch up. Not now. Not when Noah's life was on the line. "Stay close, Noah," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling, as they reached the back door. She wrenched it open, the hinges protesting loudly. Outside, the night was cold and suffocating, the dark expanse of trees and open fields stretching endlessly before them. Sarah had no idea where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay there. She couldn't risk them trapping them inside the house, forcing them into a corner. She had to keep moving. "Noah, listen to me," Sarah said, turning to face him, her hand gripping his small shoulder. "Whatever happens, stay close. Don't make a sound. We need to get to the woods, okay? Can you do that?" Noah's lip quivered, but he nodded. "I'll stay with you, Mom. I'm scared." Her heart broke hearing his words, but she gave him a reassuring smile, even though her insides were screaming. She wasn't sure they would make it out of this alive, but she couldn't let Noah see her fear. "We're going to be okay," Sarah said, even though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. She pulled him close, shielding him with her body as they sprinted toward the tree line, the night swallowing them up as they disappeared into the darkness. Behind them, the safe house door crashed open with a deafening sound, followed by shouts and the unmistakable hum of Alpha Corp's agents closing in. They were not alone in this fight anymore, and Sarah had no illusion about what that meant. They were being hunted. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she pushed forward, her muscles burning with each step. The sound of pursuit was closer now. James's voice rang out in the distance. "Sarah, you can't run forever. You'll have to face the truth eventually." Her heart stuttered in her chest. The truth? What truth was he talking about? What did he mean by that? But there was no time to dwell on it. Not when they had seconds before they were caught. She glanced at Noah, who was struggling to keep up, his small legs not able to match her pace. Her grip tightened on his hand as she helped him navigate the rough terrain, the branches and underbrush threatening to trip them both. The woods seemed endless, but Sarah kept her focus. She couldn't let fear consume her, not now. She knew they were heading toward a creek. She had remembered seeing it earlier when they arrived. If they could get there, they could hide. The water would mask their scent, and maybe, just maybe, they'd be able to escape. She didn't dare look behind her, but she could hear the agents growing closer. She could feel their presence like a dark cloud closing in, suffocating her with every step she took. They wouldn't give up. They never did. Noah was breathing heavily now, his small body trembling with exhaustion. Sarah felt a pang of guilt twist in her chest, but she forced herself to focus on what mattered most: survival. "We're almost there, Noah," she said, her voice strained. "Just a little bit farther. Can you make it?" Noah nodded, but his pace was slowing. His breath came in short, desperate gasps. Sarah's heart ached seeing him like this. He was just a child, too young to be running for his life, too young to be caught in this war. Suddenly, there was a loud snap of a branch behind them, and then James's voice again, closer now. "You can't hide forever, Sarah," he shouted. "You're only making it worse." The words hit her like a physical blow. James was right. They couldn't keep running. Eventually, they'd run out of places to hide. And once they were cornered, there would be no way out. "Mom," Noah gasped, pulling on her sleeve. I can't. I know, baby. Just hold on, Sarah said, her voice cracking as she scooped him up into her arms, carrying him as fast as she could. His small weight was an added burden, but she would never leave him behind. Not for anything. The creek was just ahead, and Sarah pushed herself harder, her breath coming in ragged gasps as they neared the edge of the water. She could hear the rush of the stream before she saw it, and it gave her hope. Just a little longer. But as they reached the water's edge, Sarah froze. A figure appeared ahead of them, stepping out from the darkness. She hadn't seen him approach. Her heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively drew Noah closer, her free hand reaching for the gun she had dropped earlier. It was the woman, the agent from before, the one who had been with James. She was standing in their way, blocking their escape. Going somewhere? The woman asked, her voice cold and devoid of emotion. Sarah's blood ran cold. There was no way around her. She had them cornered. We don't have to do this, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. We can leave. You don't have to take us back to them. We've got nothing left to give. Noah's not a weapon. He's just a kid. The woman's eyes flickered, but her expression remained unchanged. It's too late for that. You've already made your choice. There's no turning back. With that, the woman stepped forward, her hand reaching out toward Noah. No! Sarah screamed, stepping in front of him, her body trembling with adrenaline. Stay away from him. But the woman didn't listen. She grabbed for Noah, her fingers brushing the back of his neck. In that moment, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't let this woman take Noah, not without a fight. With every ounce of strength she had left, she shoved the woman back, using the momentum to propel them both toward the creek. The woman stumbled but quickly regained her footing, charging after them. Sarah! No! James shouted from behind, his voice full of panic. But it was too late. Sarah and Noah were already in the water, their feet slipping on the rocks as they scrambled to get deeper into the creek. It was their only chance. The freezing water slammed against Sarah's legs as she fought to keep her footing, her body numb from the cold. She gritted her teeth against the biting chill, her breath fogging in the air as she moved as quickly as she could, clutching Noah tightly to her chest. The sound of rushing water filled her ears, drowning out the shouts of James and the woman who had been chasing them. Noah was trembling in her arms, his tiny body cold and exhausted. Sarah could feel the weight of him, both physically and emotionally. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He wasn't supposed to be running for his life, fighting for survival in this dark, terrifying world. But this was the reality they were trapped in now, and there was no going back. Mom, I'm scared, Noah whispered, his voice breaking as he looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. I know, sweetheart, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. But we have to keep going. We're going to be okay. I promise. She could feel the water rising as they waded deeper into the creek, the current tugging at her legs. The rocks beneath her feet were slippery, and every step felt like it took more effort than the last. Her muscles burned with exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. She couldn't let herself slow down, not when they were so close to the one chance they had left. The sound of footsteps was still there, though, growing louder with each passing second. They weren't alone, and she knew they wouldn't be for long. The woman? Sarah couldn't remember her name, but she didn't need to, wouldn't stop until they were captured, until Noah was back in Alpha Corp's hands. Hold on tight. Noah, Sarah said, her grip tightening around him. We're going to find a way out of here. Just keep holding on. But just as the words left her mouth, a voice rang out from behind them. Close, too close. You can't run forever, Sarah. James's voice was a low growl, full of frustration. You know this isn't over. You're just making things worse for yourself. Sarah felt her heart race as she glanced over her shoulder, seeing James and the woman closing in. The water swirled around them, pulling them further downstream with every passing second. They couldn't outrun them on foot, not with the creek's current working against them. But there was something else, their eyes. The woman's eyes were glowing unnaturally, and James, though he was still in pursuit, had a look in his eyes that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. He wasn't the man she had known. He was something else now. Mom, what's happening? Noah asked, his voice tinged with fear. I don't know, baby, Sarah said, struggling to keep the panic out of her voice. But we're going to get through this. They reached a bend in the creek, the water getting deeper and more treacherous. Sarah's heart raced as she realized the danger. They had to find higher ground, now. The creek was becoming a rapid, and soon it would carry them away, and they'd be lost in the darkness. Noah, I need you to hold on tight, okay? Sarah said, her voice firm but full of urgency. Noah's arms tightened around her neck as Sarah waded through the water, her feet slipping on the rocks beneath her. She spotted a small ledge ahead, a higher part of the creek bank that could give them the advantage they needed. With everything she had, she pushed forward, water splashing around her with every frantic step. The current was relentless, but she couldn't stop. Not now. She reached the ledge and struggled to pull herself and Noah out of the creek, her fingers slipping on the wet ground. But with a final push, she hoisted herself up, then grabbed Noah and pulled him onto the higher bank. She looked back toward the creek, expecting to see James and the woman in pursuit. But when she glanced behind her, she saw something worse, much worse. A dark, shadowy figure was standing at the edge of the creek, watching them. The figure was cloaked in black, its face obscured by the shadows, but the presence was undeniable. Something about this figure felt different, colder, like it didn't belong to the world they knew. Noah clutched her tightly, his body shaking. Mom, what is that? I don't know, Noah, Sarah said softly, trying to steady her breathing. But we need to move. Now. They couldn't afford to stay here any longer. She couldn't risk Noah seeing whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted. But as Sarah tried to lead them deeper into the woods, the figure stepped forward, moving with an eerie, unnatural grace. The air seemed to grow colder with every step it took, and Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine as the figure's presence seemed to draw nearer. Sarah, a voice whispered, low and unearthly, just barely audible over the sound of the rushing water. You have something we need. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Her heart stopped. The voice was unmistakable. It was Claire. Sarah whipped around, her breath caught in her throat. Claire was standing behind the figure now, her expression hollow, her eyes darkened in a way Sarah had never seen before. Claire? Sarah gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Is that really you? Claire didn't answer. Instead, her eyes flickered to Noah, and the unspoken understanding between them was clear. No, Sarah said, backing away, her voice trembling. No, you're not Claire. Not anymore. Mom, Noah said quietly, his small voice tinged with fear. Who is that? Before Sarah could respond, the shadowy figure stepped forward, raising a hand as though commanding them to stop. The air crackled with an energy she couldn't comprehend. It felt like something ancient, like it had been waiting for this moment for far longer than either of them could fathom. Give the child to us, the figure said, its voice a cold, echoing sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. It's time. No, I won't let you take him, Sarah shouted, her protective instincts kicking in. She had no idea what kind of power the figure possessed, but she knew one thing for sure. Noah was hers to protect, and she would die before she let them take him. Her body tensed, ready to fight, but the figure stepped forward, its power radiating in a way that left her no room to act. Sarah, Claire's voice cut through the air, but it was empty, robotic. You don't have a choice anymore. Everything seemed to freeze, the world around them holding its breath. Sarah's heart thudded painfully in her chest. Was this the end? The forest stood still. The night air, once crisp and cold, now felt suffocating, as if the world had stopped turning for just a moment. Sarah's mind raced, heart pounding against her ribcage, as she stood frozen in front of the dark figure. The strange, unnatural presence radiating from it was overwhelming, an energy so foreign and alien that it made her head spin. Noah clung to her, his small hands trembling, his wide eyes glued to the figure ahead. He didn't understand it, not yet, but Sarah knew he could feel the danger. How could he not? The air itself felt like it was charged, ready to explode. Mom, what's happening? Noah whispered, his voice small and fragile, just as his hand curled tighter around Sarah's jacket. Her voice faltered as she fought to hold onto her composure. She couldn't show him fear. Not now. I don't know, baby, Sarah said, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound calm. But we have to stay strong, okay? We're going to get through this together. The dark figure didn't speak again, but Sarah could feel its presence growing more intense with each passing second. The chilling silence that followed felt almost suffocating. Claire, or the thing that resembled her, stood beside the figure like an echo of the woman Sarah had once known, her face pale and blank, her eyes like glass, devoid of the warmth and life that had once been so familiar. Claire, please, Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking, raw. I know it's you. Fight it. You can't let them control you like this. But the response was nothing short of chilling. The figure's voice, low and cold, emanated like a shadow, distant and yet terrifyingly close. She's gone, the figure said. She's never coming back. The choice has already been made. Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. This was worse than she had imagined. This thing, whatever it was no longer her sister. It wasn't Claire. Claire had died long ago, lost to whatever dark forces had taken her. No, Sarah whispered, her words breaking like glass. She took a step forward, but her legs trembled beneath her, unwilling to carry her closer to the nightmarish truth. Claire, please, she shouted, desperation clinging to her voice. You're in there. I know you are. I won't let you go. For a moment, Claire's eyes flickered, just a flicker. A spark of recognition? It could have been. But then, the glassy emptiness returned, and Sarah's heart broke into pieces. The shadowy figure behind Claire stepped forward, and the air around them seemed to thicken with an unnatural weight. It was clear now that this wasn't just about Noah. It was about something much bigger. This wasn't some random encounter. This was a battle for something neither Sarah nor Noah understood yet. Something far too powerful, far too dangerous. We are beyond your control, the figure said in a tone that felt like ice. You can't fight what's already been set in motion. The child, he is the key. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She had known it, deep down. Noah wasn't just some innocent bystander. He wasn't just the kid she loved and protected. He was the key. But to what? What did they want with him? Why? She asked, barely able to choke out the word. Why him? The figure's eyes glowed faintly as it stepped closer, a dark aura radiating from it. He is special, Sarah. He was born to this. And now, he will fulfill his purpose. Her stomach twisted in knots. Noah, only 3 years old, had no idea what he was a part of. She couldn't allow them to take him, whatever that meant. He was just a child, and this was madness. It couldn't be real. It couldn't. Mom, Noah whimpered, tugging at her jacket. What's going on? Sarah's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle slipping into place with terrible clarity. Whatever power these people, these beings, held, it wasn't just about them taking Noah. They needed him for something. For what? She had no answers, but one thing was certain. If she let them take Noah, everything she had fought for would be lost. She couldn't lose him. Her heart swelled with a fierce protective love, a mother's love. It was stronger than any fear, any force that stood before her. No matter what this figure said, no matter how powerful it was, she was his mother. She would fight to her last breath to keep him safe. The figure seemed to sense her resolve, its eyes narrowing as if testing her. You don't have the strength to resist, Sarah, the figure whispered, a dark promise in its voice. Not this time. Sarah's heart was pounding, but her hand was steady as she held Noah. She couldn't run. She couldn't escape. Not without Noah, and not without understanding the truth. But just as the figure raised its hand, signaling the final move, a voice, a familiar voice, cut through the tension like a knife. Let them go. It was Claire's voice, clear and strong. Sarah's heart stopped. Claire, she whispered, stepping forward. The figure paused. It turned, slowly, its attention shifting. And in that moment, something shifted in Claire's eyes. A flicker of recognition, a spark of life. I'm sorry, Sarah, Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. I couldn't fight them. They made me do this. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she couldn't find the words to speak. What could she say to her sister? What could she say to someone who had been lost to this? The figure began to growl, its voice low and angry. You don't have the right to make choices anymore, Claire. But Claire stood firm. I do, she said. I do have the right, and I'm choosing them. The figure recoiled as if struck by an invisible force. It faltered, momentarily shaken. That brief moment of hesitation was all Sarah needed. Run, Sarah! Claire screamed, her voice urgent. Take him and go. You have to protect him. The figure roared in fury, lunging forward, but Claire was faster. She stepped between them, her own power surging out, sending a shockwave through the air. Noah! Sarah shouted, grabbing her son and pulling him away as quickly as possible. We have to go. Now. Without looking back, Sarah ran, her feet slipping on the wet ground. She didn't know how much time they had before the figure regained its strength, but it didn't matter. She had to get Noah to safety. That was all that mattered now. As they disappeared into the night, the air behind them crackled with dark energy. But Sarah didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had made her choice. She would protect Noah, no matter the cost. The forest was a blur as Sarah sprinted, her legs burning, her heart racing. She could feel Noah's small, trembling body pressed against hers as they ran. The night air was sharp, but she barely noticed the chill. The only thing that mattered now was getting away, getting to safety. She could still hear the echoes of Claire's voice in her mind, urging her to keep moving, but she didn't dare look back. The world was spinning, everything was out of control, and yet, in this moment, she had to hold on to something, anything. And the one thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't let them take Noah. Not now. Not ever. The woods were thick and dense, but Sarah pushed through, moving with the urgency of a woman whose very life depended on it. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Every step was a struggle. Her muscles ached. Her body screamed for rest, but she pushed forward. The figure, Claire's dark counterpart, was still out there. She could feel it, like a presence lurking just beyond the trees. But Sarah wasn't going to let it win. She couldn't. Not after everything they had been through. After what seemed like an eternity of running, Sarah finally saw a break in the trees, a clearing. She forced herself to keep moving, her feet barely touching the ground as she headed toward the faint light in the distance. It was a house. A small, unassuming cabin nestled in the clearing. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Safety. At least for now. Mom, Noah whispered, his small voice full of fear. Are we safe? We're safe for now, Sarah said, trying to reassure him, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. We just need to get inside. Keep close. As she reached the cabin, Sarah glanced around, her senses on high alert. The air felt different now, like the calm before the storm. But the storm had already come, and Sarah didn't know what the aftermath would look like. She knocked on the door, her hand shaking, but she didn't have the luxury of hesitation. Whoever lived here had to help. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged man with graying hair and a concerned expression. He looked Sarah up and down, his eyes flicking to Noah, and then back to her. What's happened? He asked, his voice full of suspicion. Please, we need help, Sarah said, trying to keep the panic from seeping into her voice. They're after us. They're not human. I don't know how long we have, but we need a place to hide. The man hesitated for a long moment. Then, after a quick glance over his shoulder, he stepped aside. Come in, he said, his voice softening. Hurry. Sarah didn't waste a second. She stepped inside, guiding Noah through the doorway as quickly as possible. Once inside, the man shut the door behind them and locked it. Sarah immediately looked around, scanning the room. It was simple but well kept. A small kitchen, a couple of chairs, a wooden table, and a stone fireplace that crackled with warmth. We're safe for now, the man said, his tone reassuring but tinged with an undercurrent of worry. But you'll need to explain what's going on. Who are they? What do they want with your son? Sarah sank into one of the chairs, still holding Noah tightly in her arms. Her heart was still pounding, but her mind was racing even faster. She didn't have all the answers, but she needed to make sense of everything. "They're part of a group, Alpha Corp," Sarah said, her voice trembling with emotion. "They want Noah. He's not like other kids. He has something inside him, something that makes him special, and they will do anything to get him back." The man raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Alpha Corp? I've heard rumors about them. They've been around for years, but no one really knows what they're up to. They have power, way more than anyone realizes," Sarah continued, her voice low. "And they're not just after Noah. They're after everything he represents, everything he is." Noah clung to her, his small face pressed against her chest, as if trying to block out the terrifying world around him. Sarah's heart ached as she held him, wishing more than anything that she could shield him from the horrors they had already faced. "But we can't stay here forever," the man said, breaking Sarah out of her thoughts. "They'll come looking for you. They'll find you. They'll burn this place to the ground if they have to." Sarah looked up at him, her mind spinning. What was she supposed to do now? Where could they go? How could they fight back against a force like this? "We'll figure it out," she said, though the words felt hollow. "We have to. I won't let them take Noah. I won't let them win." The man nodded, as if he understood the depth of her resolve. "Do you know what they want with him?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. I don't even know what he is, but I'm going to find out. I have to." The man studied her for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "I have some people who might be able to help you," he said slowly. "But it's dangerous. Very dangerous. If you're willing to risk everything, I can put you in contact with them. But you need to understand, there's no turning back once you make that decision." Sarah stared at him, feeling the weight of his words press down on her. There was no easy way out of this. They couldn't just run. They couldn't hide forever. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," she said, her voice firm with determination. "I'll protect my son. I'll fight for him, no matter what it costs." The man nodded. "Then it's time you learn the truth. Follow me." Days passed in a blur. Sarah and Noah remained in the cabin, hiding from the world outside, but their moment of peace was fleeting. Soon, the whispers of Alpha Corp's reach began to close in again, but this time, Sarah was no longer alone. She had allies. She had a purpose. And most importantly, she had a son who was the key to a future they could no longer ignore. The fight for their survival had only just begun. But now, Sarah knew one thing for sure. She would not stop until Noah was safe. No matter the cost, no matter the odds. The world was changing, and Sarah and Noah would have to rise to meet the challenges ahead, together. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?